and welcome everyone. This is the training on writing scientific reports hosted by Wonders of the Mekong. And I wanted to say thank you to Young Eco Ambassadors for helping us to organize the training today. And thank you to Samadi for translating.
អរគុណទាំងអស់គ្នាដែលបានចូលរួមហើយអរគុណខាងពុទ្ធលី YA Young Eco Ambassador ដែលជាអ្នករៀបចំកម្មវិធីជំនុំមុខឲ្យ Wonders of the Mekong ផងដែរខ្ញុំឈ្មោះសាមនីជាអ្នកបកប្រែប៉ុន្តែខ្ញុំអត់បកប្រែដោយអ្នកបកបដិញ្ញាគ្រាន់តែបកហើយនឹងដូចជា co-train ជួយបញ្យល់ទាំងអស់គ្នាបន្ថែមលើស្អីដែល Erin គាត់នឹងបរៀនពួកខ្ញុំគាត់ដឹងថាទាំងអស់គ្នាអាចស្ដាប់បានគាត់បានមួយចំនួនធំប៉ុន្តែអីដែលខ្ញុំចាប់បានលើសពីទាំងអស់គ្នាឬក៏ខ្ញុំបន្ថែមបានខ្ញុំនឹងបន្ថែមអញ្ចឹងវាមិនមែនដូចជាអ្នកបកបដិញ្ញាពេលដែលយើងចូលរួម workshop នៅខាងក្រៅទេហើយបើសិនជាមានសំណួរunmute ខ្លួនឯងឬក៏ drop នៅក្នុង chat box ជាភាសាខ្មែរជាភាសាអង់គ្លេសតាមចិត្ត
Right, so I'm the communications director at FISHBIO, a fisheries consulting company. And this training will cover writing scientific reports, specifically on communicating conservation research studies.
អញ្ចឹង Erin គាត់ជា communication director ប្រធានផ្នែកទំនាក់ទំនងនៅក្រុមហ៊ុន FISHBIO ហើយ FISHBIO គឺជាក្រុមហ៊ុន consulting firm ធ្វើការរឿង fishery conservation នឹងហើយ workshop ថ្ងៃនេះគឺនិយាយពី writing scientific report ការសរសេររបាយការណ៍បែបវិទ្យាសាស្ត្រហើយវាបណ្ដុំបណ្ដាលស្ដីពីការចែកចាយព័ត៌មានដែលយើងទទួលបានពីការងារស្រាវជ្រាវអភិរក្សនឹងឲ្យវាមានប្រសិទ្ធភាពជាងមុនព្រោះជាទូទៅពេលដែលយើងបាន result មកហើយការចែកចាយហ្នឹងក៏នៅមានកម្រិតអញ្ចឹងថ្ងៃហ្នឹងសង្ឃឹមថាយើងអាចរៀនសូត្របានថាយើងចែកចាយតាមរបៀបណាឲ្យ general audience ឬក៏អ្នកទូទៅគាត់អាចដឹងរឿងថាយើង research យើងធ្វើពីអីអញ្ចឹងណាហើយបានទទួលលទ្ធផលអីខ្លះ
Okay, so the training today will have three parts. The first will be talking about the purpose of why we write scientific reports. The next section will cover 9 different components that might be part of a scientific report. And the last section will talk about how to share your report and some next steps you might take after you finish writing a report.
អញ្ចឹងវាបណ្ដុំបណ្ដាលក្នុងព្រឹកនេះពីចន្លោះទៅ ថាជា 2 ទៅ 3 ម៉ោងប៉ុន្តែយើងព្យាយាមធ្វើឲ្យវាមិនលើសពី 2 ម៉ោងទេមាន 3 ចំណុចធំៗទី 1 គឺនិយាយពីគោលបំណងនៃការងារការធ្វើរបាយការណ៍វិទ្យាសាស្ត្រនិង purpose វាមានអីខ្លះហើយគោលបំណងទី 2 ផ្នែកទី 2 ហ្នឹងគឺនិយាយពី component គឺផ្នែកទាំង 9 នៃការសរសេររបាយការណ៍វិទ្យាសាស្ត្រមានអីខ្លះនៅក្នុងហ្នឹង ហើយចំណុចទី 3 គឺការចែកចាយរបាយការណ៍ហើយនឹងជំហានបន្ទាប់ថាយើងត្រូវធ្វើមិនទៀតពេលដែលយើងទទួលបានសរសេរឬក៏យើងសរសេរហើយ
Okay, so this first section will talk about the purpose of scientific reports. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat as I go.
អញ្ចឹងចំណុចទី 1 គឺនិយាយពីគោលបំណងនៃការសរសេររបាយការណ៍បែបវិទ្យាសាស្ត្រ ប៉ុន្តែមុននឹងយើងទៅមុខទៀតសូមជំរាបម្ដងទៀតថាបើសិនជាមានសំណួរកុំខ្លាចកុំអៀនអីឬក៏បើអត់ចង់និយាយទេអាច drop នៅក្នុង chat box ជាភាសាខ្មែរនិងភាសាអង់គ្លេសក្រុមការងារនឹងជួយមើលហើយឆ្លើយតបឲ្យទាន់ពេលវេលា
Okay, so why do we write scientific reports? Well, reports are basically one type of science communication tool, and a report summarizes why and how a scientific study was performed, and it also shares the key findings of your study with a particular audience.
អញ្ចឹងមុននឹងយើងចាប់ផ្ដើមសរសេរគ្រាន់តែសួរសំណួរថាហេតុអីក៏យើងចាំបាច់សរសេររបាយការណ៍តាមបែបវិទ្យាសាស្ត្រយូរទៅរបាយការណ៍បែបហ្នឹងគឺឆ្លើយទៅនឹងសំណួរថាហេតុអីឬក៏យើងធ្វើតាមរបៀបណាការងារស្រាវជ្រាវរបស់យើងនឹងហើយមួយទៀតគឺយើងចែកចាយលទ្ធផលសំខាន់ៗដែលយើងទទួលបានហ្នឹងតាមរយៈអីយើងធ្វើមិន
So reports can have a lot of variation in what they cover and how they're formatted, but 2 examples of the types of reports that are relevant to sort of the conservation field research area are a field report, and this is something that would summarize the activities and the results of a single field trip or a field mission to communicate what was found during that trip. Or you might write a project report that summarizes the activities and results of an entire project, and that might include multiple field seasons.
ជាទូទៅនៅក្នុងរបាយការណ៍វាមានច្រើនបែបផែនមែនតើឧទាហរណ៍ដែល Erin គាត់លើកឡើងមានពីរបាយការណ៍ពីរបែបហ្នឹងគឺស្អីដែលយើងអ្នកខាងអភិរក្សគាត់ច្រើនតែសេខាងអ្នកដែលគាត់ធ្វើការងារស្រាវជ្រាវអភិរក្សច្រើនតែធ្វើអញ្ចឹងទីមួយគឺ field report របាយការណ៍បានមកពីពេលយើងទៅ field ធ្វើការហ្នឹងគឺសង្ខេបថាពេលយើងទៅ field ហ្នឹងយើងធ្វើការអីខ្លះហើយទទួលបានអីខ្លះហើយទី2គឺ project report គឺរបាយការណ៍ពីគម្រោងទាំងមូលថាយើងបានធ្វើអីខ្លះបានគម្រោងមកមិនប៉ុន្តែទៅ field ម្ដងហ្នឹងទេអញ្ចឹងបើសិនជាការងារយើងត្រូវ collect data 10 ដងអញ្ចឹង project report ឬ cover ទាំងអស់ហ្នឹងហើយ field report អាចធ្វើម្ដងមួយអញ្ចឹងទៅ
So a scientific report communicates several things, and each of these topics corresponds to a particular section that is part of a standard report. So a report communicates why you did a study, how you did that study, what the study found, and why the study matters. And so each of these corresponds to a different section. So why you did the study would be discussed in the introduction section of a report. How you did the study would be covered in the method section. What the study found is talked about in the results section. And then why the study matters is included in the discussion section of the report.
អញ្ចឹងនៅក្នុង scientific report ហ្នឹងគឺយើងចែកចាយព័ត៌មានទូទៅមាន4ចំណុចហើយឆ្លើយនឹងសំណួរហើយនៅក្នុងសំណួរទាំង4ហ្នឹងគឺវា correspond ហ្នឹងបានន័យថាវាចូលទៅក្នុង section 4ហ្នឹងហើយដូចជា introduction method result ហើយ discussion អញ្ចឹងទី1សំណួរហ្នឹងសួរថាហេតុអីក៏យើងធ្វើការងារស្រាវជ្រាវហ្នឹងអញ្ចឹងសំណួរមួយហ្នឹងយើងសរសេរនៅក្នុង introduction សំណួរទី2 how you did the study យើងធ្វើ study នឹងតាមរបៀបណាអញ្ចឹងឆ្លើយតបទៅនឹង section method អញ្ចឹងយើងរៀបរាប់មកថានៅក្នុង method យើងធ្វើតាមរបៀបណាហើយទី3វាបានលទ្ធផលអីខ្លះ what the study found រកឃើញអីខ្លះមានអីថ្មីមានអីប្រែប្រួលអត់អញ្ចឹងយើងនិយាយរឿងហ្នឹងនៅក្នុង result ហើយចំណុចទី4ថាហេតុអីក៏ការ study របស់យើងនឹងវាចាំបាច់ធ្វើដើម្បីអីអញ្ចឹងយើងទៅឆ្លើយសំណួរហ្នឹងនៅក្នុងផ្នែក discussion របស់ report របស់យើងណា
So when you're writing a report, as with any type of communication, it's really important to know who your audience is. So that is, who is this report for? And there might be a couple of different options. So will you be sharing your report internally just with members of your own organization? Or is this report going to be shared with a specific limited audience, such as your donors or maybe key stakeholders and collaborators? Or will you be sharing your report externally with the general public and you want it to be distributed as far as possible? So depending on who your audience is will determine how you write the report and the topics that you focus on, and also how you distribute it.
អញ្ចឹងពេលដែលយើងសរសេរ report មុននឹងចាប់ផ្ដើមសរសេរឬក៏របៀបសរសេរហ្នឹងយើងគួរតែសួរថាអ្នកណាជា audience អ្នកណាជាប្រិយមិត្តអ្នកណាជាអ្នកអាន report របស់យើងទី1អាចសួរខ្លួនឯងថាយើងចង់ចែកចាយ report មួយហ្នឹងនៅតែក្នុងស្ថាប័នយើងឬក៏អ្នកជំនាញស្និទ្ធស្នាលក្នុងចង្កោមទូចមួយឬក៏ទី2 report ហ្នឹងចែកចាយទៅក្រៅដែរប៉ុន្តែមិនច្រើនទេទៅអ្នកសំខាន់ដូចជា donor ឬអ្នកពាក់ព័ន្ធឬក៏អ្នកដែលសហការជាមួយហើយទី3ឬក៏យើងចង់ចែកទៅមនុស្សទូទៅតែហ្មងអ្នកណាក៏អាចមើល report ហ្នឹងបានដែរអញ្ចឹងសំណួរហ្នឹងវាសំខាន់នៅពេលដែលយើងចាប់ផ្ដើមសរសេរឬក៏វាសរសេររបស់យើងណា
So once you know who your audience is, it's important to think about what does your audience care about, because that will influence what you focus on and how you structure your report. So for example, if your goal to help other people at your organization repeat your study methods in the future so that they can compare their results to yours, that might be one goal of an internal report that you just share with your colleagues. Another example might be trying to help your donors understand the importance of your research for achieving specific conservation goals. That might be a goal of an audience or a report that's meant for a specific audience. And then finally, maybe your goal is to help the general public appreciate the conservation importance of the species that you're studying. That might be an example goal of an external report that you want to distribute broadly.
អញ្ចឹងពេលដែលយើងសួរសំណួរថា audience យើងណាគេហើយ audience យើងខ្វល់ពីអី Erin គាត់បានលើកឧទាហរណ៍បើសិនជាយើងគ្រាន់តែចង់ឲ្យស្ថាប័នយើង repeat ធ្វើ method study method ហ្នឹងម្ដងទៀតនៅថ្ងៃក្រោយឬក៏ក្រុមការងារយើងគាត់យក method ហ្នឹងទៅធ្វើនៅកន្លែងណាផ្សេងអញ្ចឹងយើងអាចចែកម្លែកស្អីដែលយើងធ្វើហ្នឹងនៅកម្រិត internal នៅក្នុងស្ថាប័នយើងតែឧទាហរណ៍ទី2គឺបើសិនជាយើងចង់ឲ្យ donor គាត់ស្វែងយល់ថាយល់ពីសារៈសំខាន់នៃការងារស្រាវជ្រាវរបស់យើងដើម្បីថាសម្រេចដល់គោលដៅអភិរក្សរបស់ការងាររបស់គាត់ឬក៏ការងាររបស់យើងហ្នឹងគឺយើងចែកចាយនៅកម្រិត limited to ចំនួនទូចមែនតើដូចដែលលើកឡើងក្នុង slide មុនអញ្ចឹងហើយឧទាហរណ៍ទី3បើសិនជាយើងចង់ឲ្យមនុស្សទូទៅ general public ហ្នឹងគាត់យល់ដឹងទទួលស្គាល់ឬពេញចិត្តឬក៏ឲ្យតម្លៃទៅលើសារៈសំខាន់នៃការងារអភិរក្សប្រភេទសត្វមួយយើងធ្វើអានឹងជា report យើងចែកចាយ report យើងទៅ external ហ្មងទៅអញ្ចឹងវាទៅសេវាខុសគ្នាតាម audience របស់យើងដែរ
So one point that I want to make is that there's no one correct way to write a report or no one style that all reports follow. There's actually a lot of flexibility in how you structure a report and how long it can be. A lot of it's really up to you. But this training will just talk about one possible format for reports. And as you can see from these pictures that reports can look very different depending on the organization that produces them. So this is just to give you a sense of one example.
អញ្ចឹងពេលដែលសម្រាប់ report ដូចឧទាហរណ៍នៅក្នុង slide ហ្នឹងអញ្ចឹងមានច្រើនបែបច្រើនស្ថានមែនតើអញ្ចឹងអត់មាន report អត់មាន style ណា no one correct report មានតែមួយឬក៏យើងត្រូវធ្វើតាម style មួយហ្នឹងទេវាមានច្រើនបែបច្រើនយ៉ាងហើយមានភាពបត់បែនច្រើននៅក្នុងការរៀប structure ក្រុមឆ្អឹងនៃការសរសេរហ្នឹងវាវែងវែងណាគឺអត់មានកម្រិតទេគឺអាស្រ័យលើយើងទាំងអស់អញ្ចឹងប៉ុន្តែ Erin គាត់ថ្ងៃនេះក៏គាត់អាចនិយាយពី format ទាំងអស់បានដែរគ្រាន់តែលើកជាឧទាហរណ៍មួយពីរទៅប៉ុណ្្នឹងឯង
Great. So next we'll be talking about the components of a scientific report. But first I wanted to see, are there any questions so far?
ជាងយើងចាប់មក section ហើយចង់សួរសំណួរមុននឹងទៅ section ទី2ចង់សួរថាអ្នកទាំងអស់គ្នាមានសំណួរអីអត់ឬក៏ទុកនៅចុងមក
Oh yeah, go ahead.
បើអត់មានស្អី
Well, if anyone thinks of a question, you can definitely just let us know in the chat. And I'll be talking about, in this next section, about an example report that should have been sent to everyone when you registered for the training. And I put it in the chat earlier, but maybe Putila, you can just put it in the chat one more time so that everyone has that example in front of them. And so today, there we go. So in this next section, I'll be talking about 9 different components of a scientific report. And so those are listed here. They include the title page, the executive summary, and the table of contents. And then these next 4 are those key components that we discussed already: the introduction, methods, results, and discussion. And then I'll talk about the literature cited section and appendices or supplemental materials.
អញ្ចឹងនៅក្នុង section នេះយើងនិយាយពី component របស់ scientific report មាន9ទី1 title អញ្ចឹងវាធម្មតាខ្ញុំគិតថាវាធម្មតាសម្រាប់យើងទេទី1គឺមានចំណងជើងមាន executive summary មាន table of content មាតិកា introduction និងសេចក្តីផ្ដើម method វិធីសាស្ត្រថាយើងធ្វើការងារនឹងតាមរបៀបណា result គឺលទ្ធផលដែលយើងទទួលបានតមកគឺយើងធ្វើ discussion យើងពិភាក្សាថាវាមាន impact អីខ្លះគឺវាមានលទ្ធផលនឹងមានន័យថាម៉េចហើយទី8ហ្នឹងគឺនិយាយពីឯកសារយោង literature ពួកពេលយើងធ្វើ scientific report គឺយើងក៏ត្រូវអាន literature ច្រើនដែរដើម្បីយោងហើយទី9គឺឧបសម្ព័ន្ធយើងមានឯកសារអីបន្ថែមចង់ជាប់ទៅក្នុង report របស់យើងហ្នឹង
So I'll talk about each of these in more detail, and I think there was a question in the chat about the discussion section, so maybe I'll wait till we get to that section and hopefully I can explain that in more detail.
អញ្ចឹងនៅក្នុង slide បន្ទាប់យើងនឹងនិយាយលម្អិតពីផ្នែកមួយពីលេខ1ដល់លេខ9ហ្នឹងហើយដែលមានជំនួសបានពីរដ្ឋាគាត់ចង់ឲ្យ clarify រឿង discussion section ហ្នឹងពេលដល់ចំណុចហ្នឹង Erin គាត់នឹងនិយាយលម្អិតហើយបើសិនជាមានចំនួនទៀតរដ្ឋាសួរម្ដងទៀតណា
So the first section of your report is the title page or the cover page, depending on how fancy of a design you do. And there's a lot of options for things that you could include on this first page, but a few of the most important things are to include the title of your report and then maybe a subtitle. So the title is usually something short that's sort of a broad overview of what the report's about, and the subtitle is more detailed. So you can see that on this example here, that the title is Fish Community and Aquatic Habitat Report. The subtitle is much more detailed about that it's an evaluation of a specific project. Then you would probably include the author of the report, whether it's the name of the person that wrote the report or the organization that put the report together. One of those two things or both would be good to include. The report date or year might be something useful to include on the cover so that people can tell how recent the report is when they look at it. And then some kind of photo that's relevant to the study is always good to include too.
អញ្ចឹងនៅក្នុង title page ហ្នឹងរបៀប design របៀបរៀបចំ page មួយហ្នឹងគឺអាស្រ័យទៅលើយើងឯងព្រោះវាអត់មានត្រូវធ្វើអីដែលត្រូវឬក៏ខុសទេគាត់នេះស្អីដែល common practice ហើយ Erin គាត់ចង់ suggest អញ្ចឹងណាទី1គឺយើងគួរតែមាន title page មានចំណងជើងធំមួយដូចនៅក្នុង report នៅក្នុងស្ដាំដៃអញ្ចឹងហើយចំណងជើងធំពណ៌ Q ហ្នឹងគឺខ្លីទេដូចសង្ខេបមួយ cover ថា report ហ្នឹងនិយាយពីអីចឹងបន្ទាប់មកយើងគួរតែមាន subtitle រៀង detail តិចមកឲ្យព័ត៌មានច្រើនលើសពីចំណងជើងធំហ្នឹងមកហើយចំណុចមួយទៀតយើងគួរបន្ទាប់ពីដាក់ចំណងជើងមាន title ហើយ subtitle ហើយយើងគួរតែដាក់អ្នកនិពន្ធហើយនឹងស្ថាប័នដែលគាត់មកអញ្ចឹង report មួយអត់មានអ្នកនិពន្ធទេព្រោះបើសិនជាអញ្ចឹងយើងអត់ដឹងថាអ្នកគេសរសេរហើយអ្នកដែលសរសេរគាត់មានសិទ្ធិទទួលបាន credit អញ្ចឹងណាយើងគួរតែមានហើយនឹងស្ថាប័នគាត់មួយទៀតគឺត្រូវតែមានឆ្នាំថាយើងធ្វើបើសិនជាបានខែឬក៏ថ្ងៃឬកន្លងប៉ុន្តែឆ្នាំហ្នឹងក៏គ្រប់គ្រាន់ដែរប៉ុណ្ណឹងអញ្ចឹងធ្វើនៅឆ្នាំណាហើយមួយទៀតចុងក្រោយគឺរូបថតគួរតែរូបអីដែលវាពាក់ព័ន្ធនឹងប្រធានបទមួយហ្នឹងហើយក៏មិនបាច់ទៅមើលទៅលោឆាយអីដែរគ្រាន់តែរូបសាមញ្ញប៉ុន្តែវាពាក់ព័ន្ធ
So I saw there's a question about whether you need to write a subtitle every time with the report, and no, you don't have to. It really depends on your decision about how long your title is, basically. So if there's a way to sum up the topic of your report in a single line or a single sentence, then maybe that's fine. But if you want to be communicating a lot of information in the title, then it's useful to break it up into two parts. So the main title is something shorter usually, and then the subtitle can be more detailed.
អញ្ចឹងសំណួរពីអ្នកចូលរួមកាលណាគាត់សួរថាតើគាត់គួរតែទៅសេពេលដែលមានចំណងជើងធំហើយត្រូវតែមានចំណងជើងតូចអា subtitle ហ្នឹងគ្រប់ពេលគ្រប់វេលាឬក៏អត់តាមពិតទៅវាអាស្រ័យទៅយើងអ្នកទៅសេហ្នឹងទេបើសិនជាយើងអាច cover ចំណងប្រធានបទយើងនៅក្នុងចំណងជើងធំហ្នឹងទាំងមូលហើយវាមិនសូវវែងទេយើងក៏អាចធ្វើបានបើតាមដាក់ subtitle ក៏បានដែរតែយើងគិតថាយើងចង់តែព័ត៌មានរៀងច្រើនអញ្ចឹងបើដាក់ ក្នុង title អាធំហ្មងវាមើលទៅស្អិចស្កប់ពេកអញ្ចឹងគួរតែបើយើងគិតថាយើងចង់ដាក់ព័ត៌មានច្រើនគួរតែមានtitle ធំមួយនិង subtitle រៀងវែងតិចមកហើយវា balance គ្នាអញ្ចឹងវាមើលទៅសមហើយអត់ញ៉ៃទៀត
So I have a question for everyone. If by looking at the cover of this report, and I know that the text is a little bit small, so maybe you can look at the version on your computer, but can anyone guess if this report is an internal report, a report for a limited audience, or an external report? ចឹងបើអត់ទាន់មានសំណួរសម្រាប់ trainer ទេ trainer សុំសួរវិញថា report ដែលគាត់លើកជាឧទាហរណ៍នៅក្នុង slide ហ្នឹងហើយអ្នកទាំងអស់គ្នាក៏អាច access អាហ្នឹងបានដែរនៅក្នុង email ពុទ្ធិលីគាត់ផ្ញើឲ្យពីមុនហើយឥឡូវពុទ្ធិលីក៏គាត់ដាក់នៅក្នុង chat box ដែរអាចចូលទៅមើលបានបើសិនជាឃើញទូចពេកនៅក្នុង slide ចឹងសំណួរសួរថា report មួយហ្នឹងគឺសម្រាប់ internal សម្រាប់តែស្ថាប័នយើងទេឬក៏សម្រាប់ limited audience ដូចជា donor ឬក៏អ្នកពាក់ព័ន្ធ ឬក៏ external សម្រាប់ general public ហ្មងអ្នកណាអាចឆ្លើយបានអត់ we've got one guess for each. There's a clue on the cover page if you look closely. And in this case, it says, so this report is submitted to, and the organization is My Village. So this report was prepared for a specific audience, which is, like a client or we were a consultant for this organization to do an evaluation. And so in this case, we put the audience on the cover page of the report itself. So this one is a limited or specific audience report. And then we have a question here about if it's appropriate to put the funding organization or donor logos on the cover page. And I think that would depend on, would depend probably on the donor. Sometimes they have those specific requirements. And I think especially if you are creating an external report for a lot of people to see and you want to give credit to all of the partners and the donors, then that becomes important to include on your cover page. អញ្ចឹង report មួយហ្នឹងបើសិនជាមើលនៅក្រោមរូបថតអាចមាន clue ឲ្យគាត់ដាក់ submitted to My Village អញ្ចឹងស្ថាប័នដែលគេតាក់ទងមក FISHBIO ឲ្យធ្វើ consulting ធ្វើ report ហ្នឹងឲ្យអញ្ចឹងមានន័យថា report ហ្នឹងគឺសម្រាប់ limited audience សម្រាប់ donor មិនគ្រាន់តែ internal ហើយក៏មិនជា external ដែរហើយមួយទៀតឆ្លើយនឹងសំណួរស៊ីវត្ថិនសួរថា cover page ហ្នឹងគួរតែមាន logo របស់ donor ឬក៏អត់តាមពិតវាអាស្រ័យទៅលើ donor ថាគាត់ចង់បានប៉ុណ្ណាដែរតែជាទូទៅតើតែថ្នាក់ external report ហើយបានយើងដាក់ logo ព្រោះមនុស្សទូទៅគាត់ឃើញអញ្ចឹងណាបើសិនជា internal ឬក៏ limited audience បាត់ក៏បានដែរ Okay, so next we'll talk about the executive summary. So this is a summary in the report that includes a brief overview or synopsis of each report section. So you would have maybe a sentence or two describing the introduction, a sentence or two for the methods, a little bit about the results, and a little bit about the discussion. And they can range in length, anywhere from one paragraph to one page. And in the example report, the executive summary is on pages 3 and 4. And so in this example, it's a very long executive summary. It's more than 1 page long, but I think typically you would try to keep the summary to 1 page. And the purpose of the summary is if someone doesn't have time to read the whole report, or they want to know generally what the report is about before they read it, they can just read the executive summary, and that should give them all the key important information that's in the report, all in a very short amount of space.
ចឹងចំណុចទី2 executive summary ហ្នឹងជាទូទៅពេលយើងបើក report មកឃើញហើយនៅទំព័រទី3ទី4អីហ្នឹងហើយគេក៏អត់ធ្វើវាវែងដែរពីមកកថាខានទៅមួយទំព័រតែប៉ុណ្្នឹងឯងហើយស្អីដែលមាននៅក្នុង executive summary ហ្នឹងគឺសង្ខេបចំណុចមួយដែលមាននៅក្នុង report ទាំងមូលមកបើសិនជា report យើងមាន10 section ជាទូទៅគេធ្វើសង្ខេបស្ទើរតែទាំង10ហ្នឹងស្អីដែលសំខាន់មាននៅក្នុង executive summary ទាំងអស់បើសិនជាយើងអត់ទាន់មានពេលមើល report ទាំងមូលទេបើមកទំព័រពីទំព័រឃើញ executive summary ហើយអានចប់មកទំព័រទៅមកទំព័រហ្នឹងទៅយើងយល់ហើយថា report ហ្នឹងនិយាយពីអីភាគច្រើនគ្រាន់តែវាមិន detail ដោយសារវាសេចក្តីសង្ខេបអញ្ចឹងណា
And so if any of you are attending the training tomorrow that's talking about scientific publications, which is another form of scientific communication, a publication has a section called an abstract. So that's similar to the executive summary, but an executive summary in a report typically has more detail, or you can have more space to include more detail than what you can put into the abstract of a scientific paper. And so even though this executive summary is the first section of your report, it's the part that you should write last at the end. Once you've written the entire report, and that way you can pull a little bit of information from each of those sections that you've already completed. So you should write it after you've finalized all the other sections of your report.
ចឹងបើសិនជាទាំងអស់គ្នាអាចចូលរួម scientific publication training Cite មាន training មួយទៀតហ្នឹងគាត់និយាយពីរបៀបទៅសេឬក៏របៀបបោះពុម្ពផ្សាយដូច journal article peer review publication អញ្ចឹងហើយ executive នៅក្នុង peer review publication គឺមាន section មួយដែលគេហៅថា abstract វាអត់ខុសពី executive summary ទេគឺសង្ខេបដូចគ្នាគ្រាន់ថាដោយសារ peer review publication គាត់គេកំណត់ទំព័រកំណត់អីតឹងតែអញ្ចឹង abstract ហ្នឹងខ្លីមែនតើវាមិនបានស៊ីជម្រៅដោយ executive summary ទេប៉ុន្តែទាំង abstract ទាំង executive summary ហ្នឹងគឺយើងគួរតែទៅសេនៅពេលដែលយើងទៅសេអីចប់ពេលយើងសេអីចប់ហើយអានម្ដងទៀតហើយគឺយកចំណុចសំខាន់ពីក្នុង report របស់យើងហ្នឹងទៅទៅសេឬក៏ផលិតជា executive summary ហើយនិង abstract យើងអាចទៅសេនឹងមុនបានទេព្រោះយើងត្រូវការទិន្នន័យពីbody report របស់យើងអញ្ចឹងណា
Okay, so next we'll talk about the table of contents. So in a report, this section helps orient your reader to the whole report by listing each section that's in the report and the page number where it's found. And this can be especially helpful if you have a very long report that the reader can know if they want to find a specific section, what page they can go to find that information. And you can, within the table of contents for the 4 key sections that we talked about, which are the introduction, methods, results, and discussion, if you have a subsection within those, or if it's multiple components within each of those, then you would list those in the table of contents. And I'll show you an example of that on the next slide.
ចឹងចំណុចទី3គឺនិយាយពី table of content metrica ចឹងទាំងអស់គ្នាច្បាស់ជាយល់ឬក៏ធ្លាប់ឃើញរាល់តែដងហើយដឹងថានឹងអីគេហើយគឺជា list ថានៅក្នុង report ហ្នឹងមានអីគេខ្លះចឹងកុំឲ្យអ្នកអានគាត់ lost ឬក៏គាត់រកអីអត់ឃើញគាត់អាចទៅរកនៅក្នុង table of content សិនមុនគាត់ទៅមើលនៅក្នុង report បើសិនជា report វិញគឺវាសំខាន់មែនតើសម្រាប់អ្នកអានហើយមួយទៀតវាអញ្ចឹងមិនត្រឹមតែ section នេះគឺថែមទាំងប្រាប់ page number ទៀតទំព័រលេខម៉ានទៅចប់មក ហើយមួយទៀតនៅក្នុង section សំខាន់ៗទាំង4ដែលគាត់លើកឡើងពីមុនដូចជា introduction method result discussion ហ្នឹងយល់ល្អយើងគួរតែមានថា subsection ព្រោះនៅក្នុងចំណុចប្រមាណហ្នឹងស្អីដែលយើងនិយាយគឺដឹងឲ្យច្រើនហ្មងមិនកន្លះទំព័រឬក៏មួយទំព័រទេវាវែងវាមានផ្នែកច្រើននៅក្នុងហ្នឹងអញ្ចឹងបើសិនជាយើងអាចចែកវាជា subsection ចំណុចទូចវាស្រួលនៅក្នុងការសរសេរហើយក៏អ្នកអានក៏គាត់ស្រួលដែរមើលឆាប់យល់ចឹងណា
So this is an example of the table of contents from the example report. And so you can see it lists each of the major sections of the report and the page number where it's found. And then under some of these sections, we have subsections within them.
ចឹងនេះជាឧទាហរណ៍ដែលគាត់បានពី example ដែលគាត់ផ្ញើឲ្យហ្នឹងយើងមើលទាំងអស់គ្នាឃើញហើយយើងទទួលបានចំណុចខ្លះគឺអត់មាននេះទេអត់មានតែចំណងជើងធំទេមានតែ section ហើយចំណុចខ្លះទៀតមាន subsection នៅក្នុងទៀតហើយទំព័រអញ្ចឹងទៅ
So you can see this lists the executive summary, which we just talked about. And there's a lot, like I mentioned, there's no one correct way to write a report. So you could have some variation or call the sections different things. So you can see that this report doesn't have a section called the introduction, but instead it has this section here called the evaluation overview. And that serves kind of the same purpose as the introduction in this report. You'll also see that there's no one section that's labeled methods, but instead it breaks it up into two different sections. So this project context and sampling approach is talking about the field methods. And within them, we have some subsections about how they selected their project sites. And then the sampling approach, which is another way of saying sampling methods, and the timeline. And then data processing and analysis is another type of methods that's also listed here.
ចឹងនៅក្នុងដោយសារតែរបៀបសរសេររបៀបធ្វើ table of content ហើយនឹងសរសេរ report ហ្នឹងវាអត់មាន one size fit all ឬក៏មានតែមួយយើងត្រូវធ្វើតាមទាំងអស់ទេយើងធ្វើមិនក៏បានដែរឧទាហរណ៍នៅក្នុង table of content មួយនេះយើងរត់ឃើញពាក្យថា introduction ទេគេអត់ប្រើពាក្យហ្នឹងហើយក៏អត់ធ្វើវាជា introduction តែប៉ុន្តែគេដាក់ថា evaluation overview ចឹង overview វិញហើយយើងក៏អត់ឃើញពាក្យថា method ដែរប៉ុន្តែវា embedded ឬក៏វាដាក់បញ្ចូលទៅក្នុង project context and sampling approach ហើយនិង data processing and analysis ហើយនៅក្នុងហ្នឹងគឺមាន section លម្អិតបន្ថែមរបៀបនិយាយពី method ទាំងអស់ហ្នឹងអញ្ចឹងមិនមានន័យថាយើងត្រូវសរសេរពាក្យថា method ដើម្បីសរសេររៀបរាប់ពី method ទេយើងប្រើពាក្យផ្សេងក៏បានដែរឧទាហរណ៍ឃើញនៅលើហ្នឹងចឹង
So essentially, the table of contents should just have all of the key major sections of the report. And then if there are these subsections, they should be listed as well. So you can see there are subsections for the results and discussion section too.
អញ្ចឹង report មួយហ្នឹងគឺមានចំណុច key important section ដូចជា introduction method result discussion ហ្នឹងអស់ហើយនឹងមានចំណុច subsection ទូទៅនៅក្នុង result នៅក្នុង discussion អស់ទៅទៀតចឹង
So next I'll move to talking about the introduction, but I saw there's a question in the chat about showing the difference between an internal report and one for a limited audience. So it's something that you might not necessarily be able to see just judging like what the report looks like. It's really more about the content of what's in the report. And part of that is based on how much does your audience already know about the topic and what do they need to know. So if you are writing an internal report that's only meant to go to your colleagues within your organization, you might not need to include a lot of background information about the history of the project or about the organization itself, because people in the organization might already know this. Also, if it's an internal report, then you might be sharing more confidential type of information that you might not necessarily want a broader audience to know. Maybe it's just meant to be seen internally. So it's more about the types of information that you put into the report and what you focus on, what you really want to draw their attention to.
យើងសំណួរបានពីកក្កដាដែលគាត់សួរថា internal report ហើយនិង limited audience report ហ្នឹងគឺវាខុសគ្នាបែបណាតាមពិតទៅវាអាស្រ័យទៅលើព័ត៌មានដែលយើងដាក់នៅក្នុង report មួយហ្នឹងឯងហើយយើងបដោតសរសេរលើអីព័ត៌មានខ្លះយើងក៏អត់ចង់យើងកង់ចែករំលែក internal យើងអាចសរសេរអីក៏បានប៉ុន្តែបើគឺយើងចែករំលែកទៅ donor ទៅអីយើងបដោតសំខាន់រឿងផ្សេងចឹងទៅយើង focus ផ្សេងយើង draw attention ថាគួរតែសង្កត់នៅលើអីផ្នែកណាមួយហើយព័ត៌មានខ្លះយើងអត់អាចចែកទៅ donor បានប៉ុន្តែយើងអាចចែករំលែកទៅក្រុមការងារមួយយើងដើម្បីធ្វើការពិភាក្សាតអញ្ចឹងណា
Well, one thing that the audience might also affect is how much effort you put into the design of your report. So if you are making a report that you want many people to see, or you really want to impress an important donor, then maybe you put in more effort to making a beautiful design and lots of nice pictures and good graphics. But if the report is just meant to be shared within your organization and they just care about the content, but it doesn't have to look as flashy or beautiful, then maybe you don't put as much effort into the design piece of it.
ចឹងការ design រៀបចំ report ហ្នឹងក៏វាសំខាន់ដែរបើមិនជាយើងធ្វើសម្រាប់ internal សម្រាប់ស្ថាប័នយើងទេយើងអត់មានមូលហេតុដែលត្រូវចំណាយពេលច្រើនថ្ងៃសម្រាប់ design វាឲ្យមើលទៅខ្ញុំល្អឥតខ្ចោះទេដូចលេងពណ៌ឬក៏លេងរូបថតអីចឹង graphic អីចឹងណាប៉ុន្តែបើមិនជាយើងធ្វើសម្រាប់ donor យើងចង់ impress ដែរថាយើងពិតជា dedicate ទៅការងារហ្នឹងហើយចំណាយពេលឲ្យវាមើលទៅល្អឥតខ្ចោះមិនមានន័យថានៅក្នុង internal យើងអត់ធ្វើឲ្យល្អឥតខ្ចោះប៉ុន្តែស្អីដែលយើងប្រកសំខាន់គឺ content ថាសរសេរមានន័យថាម៉េចអញ្ចឹងយើងមិនចំណាយពេលច្រើនឲ្យវាស្អាត
So that was a good question though. Thanks for asking. So next we'll talk about the introduction section of the report. And so this provides some background and context for your reader about your study. So it helps them understand why was this study conducted in the first place? What are the questions that it's seeking to answer? And why is the information from the study necessary or important?
ចំណុចទី4និយាយពី introduction អញ្ចឹង introduction គឺផ្ដល់នៅបរិបទនិយាយពីការសិក្សាស្រាវជ្រាវរបស់យើង background and context ហើយឆ្លើយទៅនឹងសំណួរថាហេតុអីក៏យើងធ្វើការងារស្រាវជ្រាវហ្នឹងធ្វើ research មួយហ្នឹងហើយយើងឆ្លើយទៅនឹងសំណួរអី research របស់យើងពួកពេលធ្វើ research យើងមាន research question អីចឹងទៅហើយព័ត៌មានហេតុអីក៏ព័ត៌មានដែលយើងនឹងប្រមូលហ្នឹងវាសំខាន់វាចាំបាច់កម្រិតណា
And in the introduction, you might provide some history of the key issues that you are investigating in your study, or it might include a summary of other studies, other relevant work that has already been completed. And that is something that would be really important to do if you're writing a scientific publication to be published in a peer-reviewed journal. That the purpose of this introduction is to show how a study fits in with all the other studies that have been completed on this topic. And so in that case, you would want to include citations of the other studies. So you'd want to list the author and the year of other studies that were published so that you can show how the work that you're doing relates to other scientific work that has already been published.
អញ្ចឹងនៅក្នុង introduction ហ្នឹងយើងគួរតែនិយាយពីដាក់ចំណុចសំខាន់ៗដែលបានកើតឡើងពីមុនហើយឬក៏សង្ខេបថាអ្នកផ្សេងគាត់បានធ្វើការងារអីខ្លះពាក់ព័ន្ធនឹងប្រធានបទហ្នឹងពេលដែលយើងធ្វើទៅសេ study ពីមុនហ្នឹងយើងគួរតែ include citation បានន័យថាបើមិនជា Erin គាត់ទៅសេ report មួយហ្នឹងហើយខ្ញុំបានទៅសេធ្វើ report ឬធ្វើ study តែទៅហ្នឹងពីមុនមក Erin គាត់នឹងយកគួរតែយក study របស់ខ្ញុំហ្នឹងមកដាក់ដើម្បីឲ្យឃើញថាពីមុនគេធ្វើអីខ្លះហើយ study របស់ Erin ហ្នឹងវាពាក់ព័ន្ធនឹងអ្នកផ្សេងមិនដែរមិនថាយើងធ្វើតែឯងទៅអត់មាន supporting idea ឬក៏ថ្មីពេកហើយអត់មានអ្នកគេធ្វើឬក៏វាអត់ fit in យើងគួរតែ find ឬក៏ role study ណាដែលវាស្តៀងរបស់យើងដែរមើលទៅយើងស្របគ្នាជាមួយអីដែលគេបានធ្វើហើយ add up value ទៅ study របស់យើង
So it's important to know who your audience is for your report and whether they're people within your organization or whether they're donors or whether they're just, the general public, because you want to know what do they care about and what do they already know about this topic and what information do they need to know in this introduction so that they can better understand the rest of your study.
អញ្ចឹងពេលដែលយើងដឹងមុននឹងចាប់ផ្ដើមសរសេរហើយយើងដឹងថា audience របស់យើងនឹងអ្នកណាគេយើងអាចរបៀបសរសេរយើង structure យើងខុសពី audience ផ្សេងៗគ្នាហើយអញ្ចឹងឧទាហរណ៍ថា audience យើងគឺ general public គឺគាត់មានព័ត៌មានខ្លះដែលគាត់អត់ទាន់ដឹងស្អីដែលយើងគួរបន្ថែមហើយគាត់ចាប់អារម្មណ៍លើអី
So next we'll talk about the method section, and for a conservation research study you'll probably have two different types of methods. So one would be the field methods if you're doing a field-based research study, and then the second part would be the analysis methods of how you analyze the data. ចំណុចទី 5 និយាយពី method វិធីសាស្ត្រនៅក្នុងការសិក្សាស្រាវជ្រាវរបស់យើងនឹងហើយនៅក្នុង method ចែកជា 2 ទី 1 គឺ field method មួយទៀត analysis method ថាពេលយើងទៅ field យើងទៅ collect data ប្រមូលទិន្នន័យហ្នឹងគឺយើងធ្វើតាមរបៀបណាហើយទី 2 គឺយើងវិភាគទិន្នន័យតាមរបៀបណា So first we'll talk about the field methods. One of the first things that you probably want to include is a description of your study site. So where did you conduct this study? And it's usually helpful to include some kind of map for reference. So this is the map from the example report on page 9. And it shows, so within Cambodia, where did this study take place? And then within the actual study location, here are the different sites where the data were actually collected. And then usually it's helpful on a map like this. It would be better if you also had, the name of the river and maybe the names of any nearby villages so that somebody who's looking at this map can easily tell where your study took place.
អញ្ចឹងនៅក្នុង field method យើងគួរតែរៀបរាប់ថាការសិក្សាស្រាវជ្រាវរបស់យើងនឹងឬក៏ study site របស់យើងនឹងគឺនៅកន្លែងណាយើងរៀបរាប់ជាអក្សរហើយថែមទាំងគួរតែមានផែនទីដូចឧទាហរណ៍នៅក្នុងទំព័រទី 9 នៃ report ដែលគាត់ផ្ញើយើងមើលហ្នឹងគឺមានផែនទីស្រុកខ្មែរយើងហើយគេភ័ណ្ឌពណ៌ក្រហមហ្នឹងថា study site ហ្នឹងនៅកន្លែងណាបន្ទាប់មក zoom in ឲ្យឃើញលំអិតឬក៏ចិត្តថា study site ហ្នឹងមានរូបរាងបែបណាហើយបើយល់ល្អទៀតគួរតែដាក់ថានៅទលេណាភូមិណានៅក្នុង map ហ្នឹងឲ្យអ្នកដែលអានបើសិនជាខ្ញុំស្គាល់ទីតាំងខ្ញុំឃើញឈ្មោះចឹងទៅឬក៏ខ្ញុំទៅរកបានដោយងាយស្រួលបាច់ចាំទៅសួរទេអញ្ចឹងព័ត៌មានមានទាំងអស់នៅក្នុង map របស់យើងហើយយើងរៀបរាប់នៅក្នុង field method ហ្នឹង
So also within the fields method section, you want to describe your data collection protocols. So basically, how did you collect information in the field? And you want to write this such that somebody could follow these instructions to repeat your study in the future. So you would want to say what kind of equipment you used, what kind of measurements you took, how long you took measurements for, what time of day, all those types of details. But if you, in the method section, it's usually good to include things at sort of a high level of sort of a broad overview. And then if you have very detailed protocols, like a data sheet or something for that people could actually follow, then you could include that. The very detailed version could go in an appendix at the end of your report.
អញ្ចឹងនៅក្នុង field method យើងក៏ដាក់ចូលយើងក៏ include ការ data collection protocol វិធីសាស្ត្រក្នុងការប្រមូលទិន្នន័យហ្នឹងណាព្រោះដើម្បីឲ្យអ្នកផ្សេងគាត់ឃើញថាយើងធ្វើតាមរបៀបណាហើយគាត់បើសិនជាគាត់ចង់ធ្វើគាត់អាច repeat ឬធ្វើតាមយើងបានអត់បើសិនជាយើងសរសេរឲ្យ detail ទៅអ្នកផ្សេងគាត់ repeat បានហើយបើសិនជាគាត់ចង់ធ្វើ study ដូចយើងហើយនេះនៅក្នុងការរៀបរាប់ហ្នឹងគឺវារៀងទូទៅប៉ុន្តែបើសិនជាយើងចង់បន្ថែមវិធីសាស្ត្រលម្អិតនៅក្នុងការស្រាវជ្រាវរបស់យើងឧទាហរណ៍ថាយើងមាន questionnaire យើងមាន data sheet អីយើងគួរតែដាក់វានៅក្នុង appendix នៅក្នុងសម្ព័ន្ធនៅចុងបញ្ចប់នៃ report របស់យើងបាច់ដាក់នៅក្នុង field method ហ្នឹងទេ
And if your study has several different components where you're collecting different types of data, then you would want to include a subsection in the methods to talk about each one of those. So maybe you have a section on water quality and you describe how you collected the water quality data. And then you have a section on habitat composition and you describe how you recorded information about the habitat. And then finally, maybe you have a section on fish diversity and you include the methods of how you surveyed for fish diversity and the equipment that you used to do that.
អញ្ចឹងបើសិនជានៅក្នុង field method ហ្នឹងយើងធ្វើការងារច្រើនឧទាហរណ៍ថាយើងប្រមូលទឹកផងយើងមើលត្រីផងអីអញ្ចឹងយើងគួរតែដាក់មាន subsection នៅក្នុង field method ហ្នឹងឧទាហរណ៍យើងនិយាយពីគុណភាពទឹក water quality អញ្ចឹងយើងទៅសេ method មួយមកថាយើងប្រមូលទឹកហ្នឹងតាមរបៀបណាបើសិនហើយបើសិនជាយើងមាន section មួយទៀតនិយាយពី fish diversity អញ្ចឹងយើងបន្ថែម subsection method ហ្នឹងនៅក្នុងនិយាយពី fish diversity មួយទៀតហ្នឹងមកអញ្ចឹងនៅក្នុង field method យើងអាច include បានច្រើន section មែនតើអាស្រ័យថាយើងធ្វើអីខ្លះ
And I think it can be nice to include a lot of pictures in your report to help your reader visualize what's happening with your study. And in particular, you can use pictures to illustrate certain data collection methods. And this can show your reader how the science is actually done. So in this case, this is an example from the example report. It's on page 11, and it's showing how the team collected water samples for environmental DNA or eDNA data collection. And that might be something that the reader isn't familiar with or doesn't know a whole lot about it. And so by including the picture, it can help them visualize, oh, okay, I see how you take a water sample in using this syringe as part of this methods process.
អញ្ចឹងបន្ទាប់ពីយើងសរសេរ field របៀបធ្វើ field method ច្រើនហើយយើងគួរតែដាក់រូបភាពផងដែរមើលរូបភាពទៅអ្នកអានគាត់ឆាប់យល់ជាងគ្រាន់តែអានគាត់សម័យអត់ទាន់ចេញអញ្ចឹងណាអញ្ចឹងដាក់រូបភាពមួយទៅមើលឃើញមានទឹកមានសារ៉ាងមានឧបករណ៍ត្រូវពាក់សំដៃអីចឹងអញ្ចឹងនៅក្នុងរូបនេះគឺគេទៅប្រមូលទិន្នន័យរបស់ eDNA អញ្ចឹងគាត់រូបមួយហ្នឹងយើងឃើញមានព័ត៌មានច្រើនណាខ្ញុំឲ្យព័ត៌មានទាំងអស់ហ្នឹងតាមពិតគឺសរសេរនៅក្នុង field method ហើយប៉ុន្តែវាបង្ហាញឲ្យទៅច្បាស់សម្រាប់អ្នកអានឲ្យគាត់ឃើញផ្ទាល់ហ្មងអញ្ចឹងណាអញ្ចឹងបើសិនជាយើងទៅ field យើងគួរតែព្យាយាមថតរូបយកមកប្រើនៅថ្ងៃក្រោយឬក៏នៅក្នុង report របស់យើងហ្នឹង
So the other part of your method section is describing your analysis methods. So this describes how you managed and handled the data that you collected in the field. So part of this might be describing your procedures for quality assurance and quality control, which is also known as QA/QC. And this is how did you ensure that your data were as accurate as possible? So, making sure that and also did you enter them into a database and did you check to see that the values all looked like they were realistic? And then in this section, you would also describe any of the statistics that you used or the types of analyses that you used to answer the different questions or hypotheses in your study.
អញ្ចឹងផ្នែកមួយទៀតនៅក្នុង method គឺ analysis method វិធីសាស្ត្រនៅក្នុងការវិភាគទិន្នន័យរបស់យើងអញ្ចឹងពេលដែលយើងបានទិន្នន័យហើយយើងយកមកធ្វើមិនគឺយើងត្រូវតែ ប្រាប់គេនៃដំណើរការនៅក្នុងការបញ្ជាក់ឲ្យនឹងគ្រប់គ្រងទិន្នន័យរបស់យើង quality assurance និង quality control ហ្នឹងថាស្អីដែលយើងប្រមូលបានហ្នឹងវាត្រឹមត្រូវអត់អីដែលយើងវិភាគហ្នឹងវាត្រឹមត្រូវអត់យើង cross check អីចឹងទៅហើយមួយទៀតយើងក៏គួរតែប្រាប់គេថាពេលយើង analyze យើងវិភាគនៅក្នុង software statistic call analysis ហ្នឹងប្រើ software មួយណាប្រើរបៀបណាដូច SPS ឬក៏ R ឬក៏អីចឹងណាយើងឲ្យវាឆ្លើយទៅនឹងសំណួរ hypothesis យើងតាមរបៀបណា
So I saw we have a question in the chat about the eDNA method that I mentioned before, so I can just go back and describe that briefly. So basically, this is a method that is trying to identify whether species like fish are present in the environment. It's a way of doing a biodiversity survey based on the DNA or the genetic material that they leave behind in the environment. So all animals shed skin cells or they excrete urine or feces, and all of these bits of material have DNA or genetic material in them. So it's all floating around in the water. And with this method, you filter the water and collect the traces of genetic material, and you can identify whether certain species are present. And I see that Putili is also pointing people towards a training about eDNA on our YouTube channel if you want to learn more about it.
សំណួរមកពីភិរុនគាត់ចង់ឲ្យអេរិនបញ្ជាក់រឿង eDNA នៅក្នុងរូបហ្នឹងកាលពីឆ្នាំមុនយើងក៏បានធ្វើ training មួយនិយាយពី eDNA ដែរបើសិនជាចាប់អារម្មណ៍អាចចូលទៅមើលព័ត៌មានឬក៏វីដេអូ detail នៅលើ YouTube channel ហ្នឹងតែសង្ខេបឡើងវិញថាពេលគេធ្វើ DNA ហ្នឹងតាមរបៀបណាអញ្ចឹងណាគឺគាត់បូមយកទឹកយកអីហ្នឹងប៉ុន្តែយើងមើលទៅលើជីវៈចម្រុះឧទាហរណ៍ថាត្រីអញ្ចឹងពេលដែលបូមហ្នឹងចង់ដឹងថាវានៅក្នុងទឹកហ្នឹងមានបូមហ្នឹងបូមបានត្រីទេប៉ុន្តែគាត់បានស្អីដែលវាជ្រុះ DNA របស់វាឧទាហរណ៍ថាសកៃឬក៏អីដែលវាសក់ទៅឬវាជ្រុះទៅពេលយើងប្រមូលទឹកហ្នឹងហើយយកទៅវិភាគថាមាននៅក្នុងមានត្រីខ្លះនៅក្នុងទឹកមួយសារ៉ាងដែលគាត់យកទៅមើលហ្នឹងហើយឈើអីចឹងអាស្រ័យថាយើងចង់មើលអីយើង define study របស់យើងទេហើយម្ដងទៀតអាចចូលទៅមើល YouTube នឹងបានដើម្បីព័ត៌មានបន្ថែម
Okay, so the next section of your report is describing the results. So what did your study find, or what did all of your analyses find? And so if you have multiple components in your report, like we talked about earlier, like if you have a section on water quality, a section on habitat composition, and a section on fish diversity, make sure that you present the results in the same order that you discussed in the methods.
អញ្ចឹងនៅចំណុចទី4ហ្នឹងនិយាយពី result គឺលទ្ធផលដែលយើងទទួលបាននៅក្នុង study របស់យើងបើសិនជាពេលដែលយើងសរសេរមាន component ច្រើន1 2 3 4 5ឬក៏ section ច្រើនអញ្ចឹងយើងពេលដែលយើងសរសេរ section result ហ្នឹងយើងគួរតែធ្វើវានៅក្នុង order ដូចគ្នាអីដែលយើងសរសេរនៅខាងលើអញ្ចឹងមាន component មាន sub component ទូអញ្ចឹងទៅ
And it's often useful to present your data and results either in tables or using graphs or different figures to help the reader understand them more visually. And then the text that you write in the section should be interpreting the information that's in the tables and figures, and it's helping the reader draw their attention to the key results they should be looking at within those tables and figures. So you don't simply want to describe or repeat the information that's already shown in your tables or in your figures. អញ្ចឹងពេលនៅក្នុង result ហ្នឹងបើសិនជាយើងមានលទ្ធផលដែលអាចធ្វើវាជា graph ធ្វើវាជា table តារាងអីមួយគឺរត់ទៅល្អព្រោះអាចជួយអ្នកអានឬក៏ audience របស់យើងហ្នឹងយល់លឿនពេលដែលកលេចមើលឃើញ graph ឬកលេចមើលឃើញ table ហ្នឹងគាត់អាចស្វែងយល់លឿនហើយមួយទៀតយើងនិយាយពីរបៀបសរសេរវិញនៅពីក្រោម table ឬក៏ graph ហ្នឹងមិនមែនយើង describe ឬក៏យើងរៀបរាប់ថា graph ហ្នឹងរូបរាងម៉េចឬក៏មិនចឹងទេវាគួរតែបកប្រែថា table ហើយនឹង figure ហ្នឹងមានន័យថាម៉េច
ចង់សំដៅលើអីហើយព័ត៌មានសំខាន់ដែលបានពីក្រាហ្វហើយនឹង table នឹងជាងរៀបរាប់ថា table នឹងវាមិន
So to show you an example, this is a figure from the example report. It's on page 19 of the report, and it's showing species richness, which is the number of species that were caught during the fish sampling. And we have 4 different sites here, so it's a little hard to read, but there's basically 2 locations, so Mekong and Nongសម. And then within each site, there are 2 areas. There's a control site, and then there's a site that's a protected area or a no-take zone. So these are the 4 different locations, and it's showing the number of species that was caught using 3 different types of fishing gear.
ជាងនៅក្នុងលទ្ធផលនេះជាឧទាហរណ៍ដែល Erin គាត់យកពី report នេះណា ទំព័រទី 19 បាទអាចបើកបានហើយនិយាយពី species richness នៅក្នុងទីតាំង 4 កន្លែងហើយដោយប្រើឧបករណ៍ចាត់នេសាទផ្សេងៗគ្នាឧបករណ៍នេសាទ 3
So the key point I want to make here is that the text that you write in your results section, it should not just repeat the same information that's shown in your figure. So this is an example of what you wouldn't want to write. So if you would not want to write something like, so in Mekong, the cast nets, which is shown in orange, captured 1 species at the control site and 4.15 species at the no-take zone, while the gill nets, which are shown in blue, captured 1 species at the control site and 4 species at the no-take zone. So the reason you wouldn't want to write this is that your reader can see all of that information just by looking at the table. And this writing isn't adding anything new for the reader to help them understand what's going on in this figure. So that's why I would say don't write something like that.
ចឹងនេះជាឧទាហរណ៍អីដែលគាត់ដូចបំរាមចឹងថាយើងកុំទៅសេរបៀបហ្នឹងអីព្រោះព័ត៌មានទាំងអស់ហ្នឹងគឺឃើញនៅក្នុងក្រាហ្វបាត់ហើយអ្នកអានគាត់ឃើញក្រាហ្វគាត់ដឹងហើយថា gill net នៅខាងឆ្វេងដៃហ្នឹងចាប់បានត្រីមួយcast net នៅឆ្វេងដៃនៅទីតាំងទី 1 ហ្នឹងគឺចាប់បានត្រីមួយដែរអញ្ចឹងមិនបាច់រៀបរាប់នៅក្នុងអត្ថបទដែលយើងសរសេរទៀតទេ
What would be better is your text should draw the reader's attention to the key information within the figure. So it would be better to write something like species richness was found to be much higher in the project sites. So these are the no-take zones or the protected areas compared to the control sites. So what that's saying is within each location, we have a control site and a no-take zone, the control site and the no-take zone. And it's showing the reader that, oh, this column and these columns, these numbers are higher in the no-take zone compared to the control site. In both cases, we have species richness that's higher in the no-take zone compared to their control sites.
អញ្ចឹងយល់ល្អយើងសរសេរនេះជាឧទាហរណ៍ដែលវាល្អជាងភាសាជាងឧទាហរណ៍ពីមុនដែលគាត់ខ្វែងហ្នឹងគឺរបៀបសរសេរគឺផ្ទឹមថាតនន័យនៅ control site វាមិនតនន័យនៅ no take zone ពណ៌ក្រហមមិនពណ៌ខៀវមិនជាងរៀបរាប់ថាមានតនន័យប្រមាណអញ្ចឹងយើងផ្ទឹមគ្នាទៅអាណាខ្ពស់ជាងអាណាទាបជាងអញ្ចឹងទៅ
And the text also says that the Nongសមno-take zone exhibited the highest species richness. So it's drawing the reader's attention to the fact that the numbers are highest at this area, which is the Nongសមno-take zone.
អញ្ចឹងនៅក្នុង text ហ្នឹងក៏សរសេរផងដែរដូច highlight ស្អីដែលតួលេខធំno take zone នៅខាងស្ដាំដៃដូចលេខ 5 ហ្នឹងគឺមាន species richness ខ្ពស់ជាងគេអញ្ចឹងផ្ទឹមទៅផ្ទឹមជាមួយកន្លែងផ្សេងគឺវាខ្ពស់ជាងគេមែនហើយយើងក៏ចង់ឲ្យអ្នកអានដឹងដែរថាវាសំខាន់ព្រោះវាចាប់បានច្រើនជាងគេ
So hopefully this shows how the text can interpret the results or draw the reader's attention to key information rather than just repeating the very basic information.
អញ្ចឹងព័ត៌មាននៅក្នុង ពេលដែលយើងទៅសេនៅក្នុង result text ហ្នឹងគឺគួរតែស្អីដែរសំខាន់ឲ្យអ្នកអានគាត់ចាប់អារម្មណ៍ជាជាងរៀបរាប់ថា graph ហ្នឹងមិន table ហ្នឹងមិន1 2 3 4ស្អីដែរអ្នកអានគាត់កលេចច្បាច់ឃើញមកដែរនៅក្នុង graph ហ្នឹងចឹងយើងមិនរៀបរាប់ទៀតទេវាច្រឡំដែរ
So the types of key results that you would want to include in the text, or you might want to draw your readers' attention to, include whether you have discovered anything new or groundbreaking during your study. So whether there's something that's the first of its kind, or a new species, or a new species record. Also, if there was something unusual or unexpected in the results. So if what you found was different than what you were expecting to find, then you would want to highlight that in your results. You also might want to draw their attention to some key differences or comparisons. So that's what we were doing in that last slide, was showing differences between protected versus unprotected habitat. Or you might want to show the comparison between the wet season versus the dry season sampling. And you might also want to draw the reader's attention to the extremes in your study. So what was the biggest or the smallest value? So again, in the previous slide, we showed which site had the most number of species, or which site had the least number of species.
អញ្ចឹងនៅក្នុង result ផ្នែក result ហ្នឹងខាងក្រោមនេះជាឧទាហរណ៍ដែលយើងគឺគួរតែ present key result ទិន្នន័យដែលសំខាន់មិនឃើញអីសរសេរនឹង describe ទាំងអស់ទេយើង pick មកថាអីដែលសំខាន់ហើយយើងអាចសួរខ្លួនឯងថាស្អីដែលសំខាន់ហ្នឹងគឺមានដូចជារបបកំហើញថ្មីបើសិនជារកឃើញអីថ្មីប្លែកដូច unusual អញ្ចឹងណាវាសុកអត់ដែលឃើញពីមុនដែលជួបទេឥឡូវឃើញហើយអញ្ចឹងគួរតែយកមកសរសេរនៅក្នុង result មកហើយយើងក៏អាចទៅភាពខុសគ្នាឬក៏ដូចគ្នា differences ហើយដូចជាដូចរដូវប្រាំងរដូវវស្សា protected area ឬក៏ unprotected area វាមានភាពខុសគ្នាមិននៅក្នុងការចាប់ត្រីហើយមួយទៀតគឺស្អីដែលវា extreme ដូចឧទាហរណ៍ពីមុនហ្នឹងនៅទីតាំងមួយដែលមានចាប់បានត្រីដក5អញ្ចឹងធំជាងគេអញ្ចឹងតួលេខណាធំជាងគេតូចជាងគេខ្លាំងខ្សោយអីអញ្ចឹងយើងលើកមកនិយាយមកវាគួរឲ្យចាប់អារម្មណ៍
Other things you might want to highlight is if there's anything with a sense of urgency behind it. So if you have a species that's at risk or is endangered with extinction, and it's very urgent to get information about that species, then you would want to highlight that. Or you might want to highlight the results that have implications for management and managers, or other types of decisions or conservation action. Like if you've identified this is a critical habitat that needs to be protected, then you want to highlight that in your results.
ហើយមួយទៀតគឺស្អីដែលយើងគិតថាវារៀងបន្ទាន់ណាឧទាហរណ៍ថាយើងរកឃើញថាសត្វណាមួយឬក៏ត្រីណាមួយដែលវាកំពុងប្រឈមគ្រោះថ្នាក់ឬក៏ជិតបាត់បង់ហើយជិតផុតពូជហើយនឹងយើងគួរតែ highlight នៅក្នុង result របស់យើងផងដែរហើយចំណុចចុងក្រោយគឺស្អីដែលវាពាក់ព័ន្ធជាមួយនឹងថ្នាក់ management level ឧទាហរណ៍ថាបើសិនជាយើងរកឃើញថាទីតាំងហ្នឹងមានផលប៉ះពាល់ច្រើនមែនតើយើងគួរតែការពារវាអញ្ចឹងយើងអាចចែកចាយព័ត៌មានហ្នឹងទៅថ្នាក់លើហើយគាត់អាចធ្វើអីមួយឬក៏ចាត់ចែងតាមវិធីសាស្ត្ររបស់គាត់ប៉ុន្តែ at least គឺយើងបានចែកចាយទិន្នន័យហើយទៅសេព័ត៌មានហ្នឹងនៅក្នុង result របស់យើងបើសិនជាយើងរកឃើញមែន
Photos can also be useful in your results section, and they can be used to illustrate what you found. And that might be something like some interesting species that you encountered, or showing a type of habitat that you surveyed. So this example from the example reports on page 14, and it's showing a picture of one of the species of interest that was captured during that survey.
ចឹងនៅក្នុង result យើងក៏អាចដាក់រូបថតបានដែរឧទាហរណ៍ថាយើងឃើញត្រីយើងឃើញទីជម្រកតាំងណាមួយដែលវាសំខាន់វាប្លែកវាចាំបាច់យើងគួរតែដាក់រូបទៅបើមិនជាយើងមានរូបថតណាអញ្ចឹងបើតាមពេលយើងទៅ field ហ្នឹងយើងគួរតែព្យាយាមថតរូបយកមកប្រើនៅក្នុង report របស់យើងហើយពេលនេះគឺបញ្ជាក់ហ្មងបើមិនជាដាក់គាត់ដាក់ឈ្មោះត្រីដូចខ្ញុំអត់ស្គាល់ត្រីខ្ញុំស្មានចេញទេថាត្រីហ្នឹងរូបរាងបែបណាឬក៏ខ្ញុំត្រូវទៅរកថាវាមានរូបរាងបែបណាតែបើដាក់នៅក្នុង report មកយើងឃើញឈ្មោះត្រីនេះពុំរកគ្រូឬអីចឹងទៅហើយយើងឃើញរូបយើងអ្នកអានគាត់ aware រឿងហ្នឹងហើយអញ្ចឹងវាជួយបានច្រើន
Okay, so next we'll move on to the discussion section. And so the same way as you've listed your different subsections within the methods and the results, if you have particular subsections like water quality, habitat composition, or fish diversity, make sure you discuss them or you present them in the discussion in the same order that you talked about them in the methods, in the same order that you presented them in the results.
អញ្ចឹងនៅក្នុងចំណុចទី7និយាយពី discussion ពេលដែលយើងបាន result ហ្នឹងយើងចូលមក discuss យើងគួរតែរៀបរាប់ present result របស់យើង present discussion របស់យើងហ្នឹងគឺតាម order អីដែលយើងធ្វើនៅខាងលើនៅក្នុង method នៅក្នុងliterature review ដែលយើងមើលហើយនៅក្នុង result អញ្ចឹងនៅក្នុងចំណុចខាងលើទាំងអស់ហ្នឹងនិយាយអីមុនយើងនៅក្នុង discussion ក៏យើងយកចំណុចយើងសរសេរមុនហ្នឹងមកនិយាយដែរអញ្ចឹងបើមាន1 2 3 4យើងគួរសរសេរ1 2 3 4ដែរជាងយើងសរសេរលេខ4ហើយលេខ2លេខ3ច្រាស់ជប់ច្រាស់ឡើងអញ្ចឹងណា
So the purpose of the discussion is to interpret the results and sort of provide some conclusions or some big picture kind of context about the study based off of what you found in the results. So that might be things like if you're studying a particular species, is that species showing signs of recovery or is it showing decline? Are there key threats to that species that need to be addressed and how could that be done? Your discussion could talk about whether the particular project is meeting its objectives or not, and whether there's anything that could be improved about the project.
អញ្ចឹងនៅក្នុង discussion យើងគួរតែមើល result របស់យើងហើយយកមកសរសេរdiscussion ហ្នឹងតាមរយៈដូចសំយោគឬក៏ធ្វើ conclusion ថា result យើងបានមកហើយយើង interpret ចេញជាអីឧទាហរណ៍ថាត្រីចំនួនត្រីមើលទៅធ្លាក់ចុះឬក៏កើនឡើងឬក៏មានផលប៉ះពាល់អីមាន threat អីខ្លះដែលយើងគួរតែលើកឡើងយកមកនិយាយហើយយើងអាចធ្វើអីបានដើម្បីការពារការងាររបស់យើងនឹងឬក៏ការពារជីវៈចម្រុះរបស់យើងនឹង
This discussion also can talk about how the work that you've done compares to other studies that have been done previously. So are your results similar or different to what other people have found who have studied or done similar studies? And if you talk about work that has been done by other people, then it's important to also provide the citation for those studies. So to list the author and the year of those studies within your report. The discussion can also talk about how could other work in the future build on the results of the study that you've done.
អញ្ចឹងនៅក្នុង discussion ផងដែរយើងក៏អាចយកព័ត៌មានដែលយើងទទួលបានពី result ហ្នឹងយកមកផ្ទឹម compare ទៅនឹង study របស់អ្នកផ្សេងដែរថាស្អីដែលយើងរកឃើញហ្នឹងវា in line វាដូចអីដែលគេឃើញអត់ឬក៏វាខុសគ្នាតាមរបៀបបែបណាតែពេលដែលយើងធ្វើយើង compare ទៅ study របស់អ្នកផ្សេងហ្នឹងយើងត្រូវតែមាន citation យើងដាក់ថាអ្នកណា A គាត់ទៅសេថាចេះហើយស្អីយើងធ្វើគឺឃើញស្របជាមួយ A ស្របជាមួយ B ឬខុសជាមួយ A ចុះខុសជាមួយ B អញ្ចឹង citation គឺចាំបាច់យើងអាចទៅសេតែឯងបានទេហើយអត់មាន citation ទេហើយមួយទៀតយើងក៏អាចទៅសេរៀបរាប់ពីថាតើលទ្ធផលដែលយើងទទួលបាននៅក្នុងពី study របស់យើងហ្នឹងគឺថ្ងៃក្រោយទៅយកទៅធ្វើអីទៀតបានឬក៏មាន research ថ្មីគួរតែ add up បន្ថែមទៅលើអីដែលយើងធ្វើបានហ្នឹងឬក៏មិនវិញអញ្ចឹងណា
So, like I mentioned, you might include citations within your discussion of other studies that have been published previously. So the next section of a report is the literature cited section or the references section. And that's where you list all of those studies that you've mentioned in the body of your report. You list them all in one place. And the purpose of this section is to let your reader see, the names of all these different studies, and they can see where you're getting your information from, and then they can go find this information for themselves if they're interested.
អញ្ចឹងErin គាត់និយាយរហូតថាយើងត្រូវធ្វើ citation អញ្ចឹងពេលនៅក្នុង text របស់យើងតាំងពី introduction មកដល់ discussion មាន citation 4 10 20 ឬក៏លើសនឹងអញ្ចឹងទៅដល់ចុងនៅចំណុចទី8ហ្នឹងគឺយើងត្រូវធ្វើ literature cited ឬក៏ reference section ហ្នឹងថានៅក្នុង citation ហ្នឹងយើង cite អីខ្លះនេះដូច detail របស់ citation ហ្នឹងអញ្ចឹងមិនគាត់ដាក់ឈ្មោះហើយនឹងឆ្នាំទេប៉ុន្តែយើង detail ហ្មងថាអ្នកស្ថាប័នណាអ្នកបោះពុំតាំងពីកាលមានមនុស្សប្រមាណអ្នកចូលរួមអីចឹងទៅបើព្រោះនៅក្នុង citation យើងបើសិនជា report ឬក៏ journal ហ្នឹងមាន10អ្នកយើងអត់អាច cite ទាំង10ទេអញ្ចឹងនេះជាឱកាសដែលយើង cite ទាំងអស់គ្នាហើយមួយទៀតអ្នកដែលអានបើសិនជាគាត់ចាប់អារម្មណ៍ព័ត៌មានហ្នឹងគាត់អាចទៅរកបាននៅក្នុងឯកសារណាអញ្ចឹងពេលគាត់ចូលទៅមើល reference section ទៅគាត់ឃើញហើយថាគាត់ត្រូវរកឯកសារហ្នឹងនៅកន្លែងណាឈ្មោះអីអញ្ចឹងទៅ
So this is the example literature cited section from the example report. It's on the last page, page 29. And so it just lists a few studies, but it lists the author of each study, the title of the study, and then where the study was published. If it was published in a journal, if it was published on a website, and it'll have the date or the year that the study was published as well.
អញ្ចឹងអានេះវានៅក្នុង reference section ហ្នឹងនៅទំព័រចុងក្រោយរបស់គេផ្នែកទី8ហ្នឹងដាក់ព័ត៌មានទាំងអស់ហ្មងរបាយការណ៍ report ខ្លះវាមិនមែនជា journal article ទេអញ្ចឹងវាដូចជាទី1យើងមើលឃើញហ្មងថាវាមិនជា journal វាជា report របស់ស្ថាប័នណាមួយចឹងទៅហើយនៅក្រោមហ្នឹងគេមាន volume អីជា journal ឈ្មោះ journal អីចឹងទៅអញ្ចឹងប្រភេទ report ក៏យើងដឹងដែរពេលដែលយើងមើលនៅក្នុង reference ហ្នឹងនៅឆ្នាំណាចំណងជើងណាស្ថាប័នណាអញ្ចឹងណា
Okay, so like I mentioned, the literature cited section can tell your reader where you got your information from. And there are many different styles of formatting your citations or your references. And the key is just to make sure that all of the citations use the same style. So if you are going to submit your report as a scientific publication to be published in a journal, the journal will have a very specific style of how they want you to format those references. And there are programs, there's one called EndNote and another one called Mendeley that can help you format your references. And just so as an example, I realized that even in this report, they're not all formatted in the same way. But so an example of a style would be, do you list the year with parentheses around it or not? Those are two different styles. And so in this report, they should have chose one or the other. But that's one example of how the style might be different from journal to journal.
អញ្ចឹងនៅក្នុង reference section ហ្នឹងយើងត្រូវតែ follow style ណាមួយយើងអាចទៅសេដូចនៅក្នុងនេះហើយគាត់អត់បាន follow style ត្រឹមត្រូវទេហើយយើងក៏អាចប្រើ program សម្រាប់ជួយបានដូចជា EndNote ឬក៏ Mendeley អញ្ចឹងគេមាន format របស់គេឲ្យយើង follow អាចស្រួលឬក៏ពិបាកអាស្រ័យលើ individual ទេហ្នឹងប៉ុន្តែជាទូទៅគេប្រើច្រើនអញ្ចឹងខ្ញុំគិតថាវាជួយបានច្រើន ហើយយើងក៏ត្រូវតែ follow បើយើង pick style ណាមួយឬក៏ឧទាហរណ៍យើង publish នៅ journal ណាគេអាចទីឲ្យថាយើងត្រូវទៅ follow style អីគេអញ្ចឹងយើងធ្វើតាមគេទៅបើសិនជាអត់ទេយើងក៏ត្រូវធ្វើឲ្យវា consistent ដែរយើងអាចចេះតែ say style ណាដែលយើងចង់បានហើយពេញណាពេញណីចឹងទេ
Yes, I see we have a few questions. So one is asking about what does this volume 443 refer to? And so some journals will list the different volume of that journal. Each volume that comes out or each edition that comes out every month or every few months will have its own number. And sometimes there will even be an issue number for that particular journal. So you might have two numbers here sometimes, and whether you include it or not really depends on what kind of citation style or format you're using, and whether that will tell you whether this is necessary or not. And then we have another question about is it appropriate to cite information from unpublished reports or internal reports? So that's a great question, and we'll talk about this in the next section of the difference between reports, like what we're talking about today, and scientific published studies. It is, I think, useful to include in more formal reports if that's the only source of information that's relevant to your study. So if there's if that information can only be found in a report, it can't be found in a scientific study, I think it's okay to include that as a citation. I know that when you are trying to submit your paper to a scientific journal, they want to make sure that you haven't only included unpublished reports or what's called gray literature. They want to make sure that you are mostly citing the published literature, and it's okay to occasionally have a few unpublished reports. I think sometimes they want to make sure as long as that report is easily accessible by the public, if they can find it online somewhere, then it's okay to cite it.
ជាងសំណួរទី1ដែលសួរថាដូច volume 443ហ្នឹងមានន័យថាម៉េចគួរតែដាក់អត់ឬក៏អីចឹងទៅតាមពិតនៅក្នុង journal មួយ volume វា journal ខ្លះមួយឆ្នាំរបស់2 ដង 3 ដងអញ្ចឹងគេមាន volume ច្រើនពេលខ្លះមានលេខមួយទៀតមិនគាត់ហៅអីខ្ញុំភ្លេចបាត់ហើយលើកពី volume ហ្នឹងអញ្ចឹងណាsection ណាអញ្ចឹងមានលេខលើសពី443នឹងទៀតមានក្នុងវគ្គកញ្ចក់ហ្នឹងអញ្ចឹងវាអាស្រ័យទៅលើថា journal ហ្នឹងគេបោះញឹកប៉ុណ្ណាគេប្រើរបៀបណាប៉ុន្តែសំណួរដែលសួរថាយើងគួរតែដាក់លេខ443នៅក្នុង reference section ហ្នឹងឬក៏អត់គឺអាស្រ័យទៅលើ reference style របស់យើងឯងថាស្អីដែលយើងយកយើងប្រើ reference style មួយណាអញ្ចឹង reference style វាខុសគ្នាខ្លះទីមទៀតដាក់ខ្លះអត់ទីមទៀតទេហើយសំណួរមួយទៀតគឺសួរថា grade literature report ដែលអត់បាន publish ជា journal ទេយើងគួរតែយកប្រើអត់តាមពិតreport ខ្លះអត់បានទៅដល់គាត់អត់បានយកទៅ publish ទេឬក៏គាត់គ្រាន់តែធ្វើសម្រាប់ស្ថាប័នរបស់គាត់ឬក៏ធ្វើជា report របស់ខ្ញុំជាសភៅធម្មតាមិនជា journal ផ្ញើទៅជា journal article ទេយើងនៅតែប្រើបានទាំងអស់ហ្នឹងដែលគេហៅថា grade literature ហ្នឹងណាគ្រាន់ថាជាទូទៅពេលដែលយើងចង់បោះពុម្ពជា journal peer review article ហ្នឹងគេទាមទារគេឲ្យតម្លៃទៅលើឲ្យយើង cite journal article ច្រើនជាងយក grade literature យកមកប្រើប៉ុន្តែក្នុងករណីដែល grade literature ហ្នឹងអត់បានទៅដល់បោះពុម្ពជា journal article ទេយើងនៅតែប្រើបានអញ្ចឹងវាអាស្រ័យទេហើយអាស្រ័យលើព័ត៌មាននៅក្នុងហ្នឹងថាវា grade របស់ប៉ុណ្ណាយើងយកមកប្រើ
Great. And then I see we have a question about how to write a literature review. So a literature review is when you are trying to summarize all the work that's been done on a particular topic. And if you were going to include that in your report, you would probably want to summarize it in some way to let the reader know, how many studies you reviewed and whether they fell into kind of different categories. So you could say, we reviewed 100 papers total, and we found, 20 that were focused on the effects of the protected area, and 50 of them were looking at, whether species were increasing or decreasing within the protected area. And you can talk about the studies, sort of give the broad overview, and maybe not, you wouldn't necessarily talk about each one individually, but you would say, here's a key point, and here's how many studies supported this key point. But then you would want to list every study that you reviewed would be included in your references section. So the body of the report would talk about sort of the studies more broadly, and you would put the citations in there, and then you would put the full citations of all the studies at the end in your literature cited section.
ចឹងសំណួរមួយទៀតគាត់សួរថាតើយើងទៅ literature review តាមរបៀបណានៅក្នុង report ហ្នឹងតាម literature review វានៅខាងលើដូចម្ដុំ background introduction នៃអីហ្នឹងហើយគ្រាន់តែចង់បង្ហាញថាយើងបានមើលឯកសារណាខ្លះឯកសារណាដែលយើងព្រោះជាទូទៅយើងអាចអានដល់100ឯកសារប៉ុន្តែមិនក៏ថាយើងយកមកប្រើទាំង100យើងអាចប្រើ9 10 20អីអញ្ចឹងទៅយើងអាចរៀបរាប់នៅក្នុងហ្នឹងប៉ុន្តែអីដែលសំខាន់គឺ citation ព្រោះយើងមើលអីយើងយកអីយកមកដាក់នៅក្នុង literature review ហ្នឹងគឺយើងត្រូវតែស្អីនឹងអីដែលចាំបាច់បំផុត plagiarism.
And then we have a question here about whether you can use footnotes instead of the references section. And I think, it kind of depends on the field that you're in or what's the standard. I think maybe more in the social sciences or humanities, they might use footnotes more. I know in the more like the research sciences or the biological sciences, it's more standard to include a literature cited section. So I think it just kind of depends on the field that you're in.
យើងសំណួរមួយទៀតគាត់សួរថាយើងគួរតែប្រើ footnote ឬក៏ reference section ហ្នឹងជាទូទៅវាមានអីខុសត្រូវទេអាស្រ័យទៅលើថាស្អីដែលយើងធ្វើហ្នឹងយើង follow format មួយណាគ្រាន់ថា common practice ភាគច្រើនអ្នកដែលធ្វើការនៅ social science ហ្នឹងគាត់ប្រើ footnote ច្រើនជាង pure science pure science គេអត់សូវប្រើទេគឺប្រើ reference section ហ្នឹងជាង footnote តែម្ដងទៀតគឺវាអាស្រ័យទៅលើថា style មួយណាដែលយើង follow យើង submit ឲ្យអ្នកណាទេអញ្ចឹង back ទៅ audience ឬក៏ប្រភេទ report របស់យើងទៀត
Yeah, these are all great questions, and some of them I might save until the end, but we have one more here about how many references should be in a report. Is there a limit, and is it better to use ones that are more recent or older? So I think it's a matter of deciding what's the most important information that you need to back up with a citation. So if you're making some kind of statement and you really and you think, oh, your reader might wonder, where did they get that information? Or is that really true? Or can I find out more information about that? You would want to include a citation for that fact. With scientific publications that are submitted to peer-reviewed journals, it's very important to include literature cited, and you might have a lot of references. With a report, it really depends on it's really up to you if you think it's important for the reader to know about these other studies that are out there and to help them find that information in the future. So there's no really one correct answer of whether you need citations or not. I think it just depends on the subject matter of your report and whether there are some key studies that are foundational to the work that you're doing. And as far as using older studies versus newer studies, I think it really just depends on how relevant they are to your topic. So if there's only one study that's been done in your area and it was done 50 years ago, then that's the one study that you should include. Even though it's an older study, it's the most relevant one to your area. And sometimes it's good to include both the old and the new studies to show, this was the original work that was done. But it is good to also, especially if you're submitting this to a peer-reviewed journal, to show the editors that you're up to date on the research and that you are aware of the more recent work that's been happening in your field. So that's why it might be good to include the recent literature too.
សំណួរទាំងអស់ហ្នឹងសុទ្ធតែ interesting question ទាំងអស់គ្រាន់ថាគាត់នឹងឆ្លើយសំណួរនៅ slide បន្ទាប់ទៀតតែចង់ឆ្លើយសំណួរចុងក្រោយមួយសួរថាតើយើងគួរតែប្រើ reference ប្រមាណឲ្យវាសមរម្យហើយនឹងក្នុង report ធម្មតា journal article គួរតែ report ធម្មតាគួរតែធ្វើ citation អត់ហើយគួរតែយកឯកសារបើ5ឆ្នាំ10ឆ្នាំទៅយើងអាចប្រើបានអត់ឯកសារចាស់ឯកសារថ្មីចឹងទៅអញ្ចឹងបើសិនជាធ្វើ report វាអាស្រ័យទេថាយើងចង់ include ប៉ុណ្ណាវាមានតាមពិតអត់មានចម្លើយមួយថាគួរតែដាក់10 20 30 40 50ក៏100 journal article ទេ citation នេះអត់មានអីone rule ចឹងណាតែគឺអាស្រ័យទៅរបៀបសរសេររបស់យើងទេគ្រាន់តែថានៅក្នុងបើសិនជាយើងចង់បោះវាជា peer review article គឺទាមទារឲ្យស្អីដែលយើងសរសេរstatement ណាមួយដែលយើងសរសេរគឺមាន backup ទាំងអស់អញ្ចឹងបាននៅក្នុង journal article យើងឃើញហើយបើងចោលរហូតមាន reference មាន citation រហូតគឺទាមទារឲ្យយើង backup ដោយសារតែវា standardize បើសិនជា report នៅក្នុង internal នៅកម្រិតគ្រាន់តែចែកចាយaudience យើងតិចទេហើយវាជា report សម្រាប់កែថែមទៀតឬក៏ទទួលសម្រាប់យោបល់បន្ថែម feedback អីទេយើងក៏មិនដាក់ reference ច្រើនប្រហែលដែរហើយសំណួរសួរថាឯកសារដែលយើងយកមកប្រើ reference យើងមកប្រើហ្នឹងបើសិនជា5ឆ្នាំឬក៏10ឆ្នាំវាចាស់អត់វាថ្មីអត់គឺអាស្រ័យទៅលើ field study របស់យើងបើចែកដល់អី field យើងនឹងមិនសូវមានមនុស្សប្រើទេអញ្ចឹងឯកសារ50ឆ្នាំមុនក៏យើងនៅយកប្រើបានដែរតែនៅក្នុង journal article គេទាមទារឲ្យយើងរកឯកសារថ្មីតែបើយើងថ្មីអស់ហើយ50ឆ្នាំហ្នឹងគឺyou did your best ហើយគឺបានតែប៉ុណ្ណឹងព្រោះវាមានថ្មីទៀតទេឬក៏មានតែមួយហ្នឹងយើងត្រូវតែដាក់ហើយទោះវា50ឆ្នាំក៏ដោយ
Okay, so I just want to move on to the last section of a report, and that would be if you have any appendices or supplemental material. So the key point here is that if you include too much information in your report, it could be overwhelming and people might be less likely to want to read your report if they see that it's very, very long. So one way to shorten your main report is to move the very detailed information to an appendix or a supplement that's at the end of the report, and then people can refer to that in more detail if they're interested. So examples might be if you want to include a very detailed sampling protocol or an example of your data sheets, if you want to make a full list of all the different species that you encountered, or include a table of all the different values that you measured for temperature or dissolved oxygen or something like that, then you could include the full data sets as an appendix at the end of your report.
អញ្ចឹងនេះជាចំណុចចុងក្រោយចំណុចទី9និយាយពីឧបសម្ព័ន្ធឬក៏ឯកសារបន្ថែមពីនៅក្នុង body របស់យើង body report របស់យើងព្រោះបើសិនជាយើងដាក់ស្អីទាំងអស់ចូលគ្នាហ្មងគឺវាច្រើនលើសលប់វាវែងពេកវាអីចឹងទៅអញ្ចឹងអ្នកអានគាត់អាចអត់អានទេហើយវាមើលទៅច្បុកច្បល់ពេកអញ្ចឹងយើងអាចដាក់ឯកសារទាំងអស់ហ្នឹងឧបសម្ព័ន្ធហ្នឹងនៅខាងក្រោយបំផុតនៃ report ឧទាហរណ៍ថាបើសិនជាយើងចង់ឲ្យគេឃើញថាយើងមាន data sheet នឹងមានរូបរាងបែបណាយើងយកត្រីយើងមើលត្រីអីខ្លះឧទាហរណ៍យើងមាន10ត្រីយើងចង់បង្ហាញរូបទៅអ្នក audience របស់យើងគួរតែដាក់នៅចុងក្រោយអញ្ចឹងដែរ data table យើងមានអីខ្លះអញ្ចឹងស្អីទាំងអស់ហ្នឹងដែលយើងអាចដាក់នៅក្នុង appendix ហ្នឹងឧបសម្ព័ន្ធហ្នឹងជាជាងដាក់នៅក្នុង report កុំឲ្យវាវែងពេកព្រោះទាំងអស់ហ្នឹងឧទាហរណ៍ questionnaire 10 page questionnaire យើងយកមកដាក់នៅក្នុង body វាអត់មានអ្នកគេអានឲ្យអស់ទេហើយវាមើលទៅលើលុបណា
Okay, so that concludes the second section of the training. And we just have one more section left, but I think this might be a good time for us to take a quick 5-minute break since we've been at it for an hour and a half. So we'll come back in 5 minutes. And if anyone else has more questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat box, and we'll keep collecting the questions and see if we can get to them at the end of the training. So we'll take a quick break, and we'll see you back here in 5 minutes.
ចឹងយើងចប់ពីវគ្គ 2 វគ្គ 1 វគ្គ 2 ឥឡូវដល់វគ្គ 3 ប៉ុន្តែសូមសម្រាប់5នាទីកុំឲ្យទាំងអស់គ្នាហត់ពេកដោយសារយើងរានឡើង1ម៉ោងកន្លះហើយអញ្ចឹង5នាទីបើសិនជាមានសំណួរអាច drop នៅក្នុង chat box ទៅហើយយើងចូលមកវិញម៉ោងដល់38 We'll be back at 10:38
Sounds good.
អញ្ចឹងទៅបន្ទប់ទឹកឬរោទឹកញ៉ាំឬក៏មកមានសំណួរអាច drop បានណា
Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. We can keep moving with our training. And so this next section, we'll talk about sharing your report and some next steps that you can take after you've written a scientific report.
ស្វាគមន៍មកវិញទាំងអស់គ្នាសង្ឃឹមថាបានញ៉ាំទឹកខ្លះណានៅក្នុងវគ្គនេះវគ្គទី3យើងនិយាយពីការចែកចាយឬក៏ចែករំលែកscientific report របស់យើងថាយើងត្រូវធ្វើតាមរយៈអីធ្វើបែបណា
So this mostly applies to if you're writing an external report, which is one that you want to be available to the general public or to a lot of people very broadly. So if you want to make your report widely available, it's useful to allow people to download it from your website. So to upload it to your website and allow people to download it. You can also email it directly to some key collaborators or stakeholders, or you can provide them with a printed copy of the report, and you can pass it out at important meetings, or put it in an informational packet. And then you can also post some key points from your report, things that might be in the executive summary on social media, like on Facebook, with some photos and maybe a link to where people can read the full report.
ចាតាមពិតទៅនៅក្នុងវគ្គនេះបើសិនជាយើងចង់ចែកចាយ report របស់យើងនិយាយទៅ make report របស់យើង widely available ចំណុចទី1យើងគួរតែ upload report របស់យើងនៅក្នុង website យើងធ្វើម៉េចឲ្យអ្នកដែលគាត់ចាប់អារម្មណ៍ហ្នឹងពេលគាត់ search ឬក៏ស្វែងរកនៅក្នុង internet ទៅឃើញហើយគាត់ download បានហើយមួយទៀតយើងអាច email ឬក៏ print ចែកចាយទៅអ្នកដែលសំខាន់ៗអ្នកដែលពាក់ព័ន្ធអ្នកដែលយើងសហការជាមួយឬក៏នៅក្នុងការប្រជុំណាមួយយើងអាច print ជាកូនសភៅជាអីដាក់នៅក្នុង kit ហើយចែកចាយទៅអញ្ចឹងសិទ្ធិអ្នកពាក់ព័ន្ធការងាររបស់យើងទាំងអស់ហើយមួយទៀតដោយសារវាជាសម័យ social media អ្នកណាក៏មាន social media ដូចជា Facebook page ហើយស្ថាប័នគាត់ប្រើច្រើន Wonder នៅ Mekong ក៏ប្រើFacebook សម្រាប់ធ្វើការ outreach នឹងច្រើនដែរអញ្ចឹងយើងអាចផុសដូចជាយើង pick executive summary ប៉ុន្តែចំណុចសំខាន់ទូខ្លីៗមកយកមកសរសេរហើយផុសនៅក្នុង social media របស់យើងជាមួយរូបថតឬហើយនឹង link ទៅ full report ផងដែរអញ្ចឹងអ្នកណាក៏អាចឃើញអ្នកណាក៏អាច access បានដែរ
So some next steps that you could think about after you've completed your report is whether you want to then try to publish your study in a scientific journal. And that's the topic of tomorrow's training. But like we talked about a little bit during the references section, reports are valuable, but they aren't always considered part of the full scientific process of advancing the state of scientific knowledge. And that's because a report is something that any organization can just write internally and put out into the world without anyone else verifying it or making sure that it's accurate. And the reports have not gone through the process of what we call peer review. So peer review means that the paper is reviewed by other experts who are in the field, who are not part of your organization and who are not associated with the study. And they can ask you questions about how you did the study. They can make sure that everything in the report is scientifically sound and robust. And so that's the main difference between reports and scientific publications. So for that reason, reports are considered, they're called gray literature, or they're, sort of seen as a slightly lesser, I guess, sort of status than a peer-reviewed journal article.
អញ្ចឹងជំហានបន្ទាប់ពេលដែលយើងធ្វើ report របស់យើងចាប់សពគ្រប់ហើយយើងអាចពិចារណាថាយើងគួរឬក៏យើងចង់យក report យើងទៅបោះពុម្ពផ្សាយជា scientific journal ឬក៏ហើយប្រធានបទមួយហ្នឹងយើងនឹងនិយាយនៅថ្ងៃស្អែកអ្នកដែលបានចុះឈ្មោះចូលរួម workshop ថ្ងៃស្អែកនៅ CKCC នឹងរៀនពីរបៀប publishing journal ហ្នឹងហើយ ប៉ុន្តែបកមកវិញគឺដោយសារតែ report គឺវាមានតម្លៃហើយប៉ុន្តែបើផ្ទឹមជាមួយនឹង scientific journal វានៅទាបជាង scientific journal ទេដោយសារតែ scientific journal ហ្នឹងគេឆ្លងកាត់ការងារច្រើនតំណែងទៀតឧទាហរណ៍មួយគឺឆ្លងកាត់ peer review អ្នកដែលអត់នៅក្នុងអ្នកដែលធ្វើការជាមួយយើងទេប៉ុន្តែគាត់នៅក្នុង field ហ្នឹងគឺគាត់មើលថា study របស់យើងឬក៏ method ដែលយើងប្រើលទ្ធផលដែលយើងទទួលបានហ្នឹងវាត្រឹមត្រូវឬក៏អត់ហើយគាត់អាចមានសំណួរសួរបកទៅបកមកច្រើនកលៈអញ្ចឹង process នៃការធ្វើ journal publish journal article ហ្នឹងវាមានច្រើនវាវែងវាពិបាកអញ្ចឹងបានគេreach a high level scientific paper ហ្នឹងអញ្ចឹងណាជាទូទៅវាស៊ីពេលអញ្ចឹងបានគ្រាន់បើ report ធម្មតាគេ consider វាថាជា grade literature អញ្ចឹងទ្រាំតែដោយសារតែ status របស់វាទាបជាង scientific journal.
One of the reasons you might consider trying to publish your study in a scientific journal is this type of publication is considered the highest standard in the field of science or the gold standard for communicating your results to the scientific community. And so the information that's in a report can sometimes be adapted to the format of a peer-reviewed publication, as long as you have enough new information to make it worthy of a publication. But it just might take some additional work to adapt, to kind of transfer the information from the format of your report to match the format of a scientific journal article.
អញ្ចឹងពេលដែលយើងយើងចង់ publish report របស់យើងធ្វើជា scientific journal ហ្នឹងព្រោះជាទូទៅ report យើងមាន style របស់យើងរបៀបសរសេររបស់យើងហើយ peer review publication គេមាន style របស់គេអញ្ចឹងរបៀប turn វាជា peer review publication ហ្នឹងវាមាន step ច្រើនយើងត្រូវមើលយើងត្រូវ twist around អីចឹងណាហើយ publication peer review publication ហ្នឹងគឺសម្រាប់នៅក្នុង scientific community គេហៅ gold standard ដែលខ្ពស់បំផុតហើយអញ្ចឹងបានវាស៊ីពេលវាត្រូវការទៅមកច្រើនតង់តែបើយើងអាចធ្វើបានreport ធម្មតាវាជា graded literature អញ្ចឹង scientist គាត់ពេលដែលធ្វើ paper គាត់ចង់បាន high standard gold standard យកមកផ្សាយវាមាន credit ជាងគ្រាន់តែ grade literature អញ្ចឹងណា
So we'll now talk about some of the differences of how the format of a report that we've just talked about might be different from a scientific journal article. So for one thing, scientific publication is usually, it usually has a limit to the number of the amount of words or pages you can have. And so for that reason, they typically do not have either a title page or the table of contents. They also include something called an abstract at the beginning of the paper, which is a short summary of everything in the paper. So it's similar to an executive summary, but it's usually quite a bit shorter, and typically they can only be about 250 words. And like we talked about during the literature cited section, references are optional for a report, but they are a requirement for a scientific publication. So you must include some citations in a scientific publication to show how your study fits into all the other studies that have been done on that topic. And sometimes you might have a lot of citations. You might have 50 to 100 citations in your study.
ភាពខុសគ្នារវាង scientific report ហើយនិង scientific publication អញ្ចឹង report ធម្មតាហើយនិង journal article ហ្នឹងវាខុសគ្នាបែបណាជាទូទៅនៅក្នុង scientific publication ហ្នឹងគឺគេដាក់ title page ឬក៏ table of content អីដូចយើងរៀនពីដើមទីហ្នឹងទេហើយ scientific paper គឺជំនួសដោយ executive summary គឺគេមាន abstract អញ្ចឹងវាខ្លីជាងវានៅតែសង្ខេបស្អីreport របស់យើងហើយប៉ុន្តែវាខ្លីជាទៅ250ពាក្យទេខុសពី executive summary ហើយមួយទៀតនៅក្នុង report ធម្មតារបស់យើងគឺពេលខ្លះយើងអាចអត់ដាក់ citation ឬក៏យើងដាក់តិចប៉ុន្តែនៅក្នុង scientific paper គឺ it's a must មកគឺត្រូវតែមាន citation យោងឯកសារហើយច្រើនទៀតកន្លែងខ្លះ ទីមទីច្រើនឬក៏ពេលដែលយើងធ្វើហ្នឹងគឺយើងជួបឯកសារច្រើនដែលយើងយកមកយកច្រើនមែនតើ
So another difference is that we discussed how it's usually beneficial for reports to have lots of color photographs and pictures, but typically in a scientific journal article, there isn't enough space to include these types of pictures. So usually you would not have them in a scientific publication. And then you might also have a lot of color in your figures and graphs of a report, but sometimes the journals might only want you to have your graphs be in black and white, and it might depend on sort of their requirements for whether they print their journal or only have it available online. And then, like we mentioned, a report, you have a lot of flexibility in how many sections you have and what you call them, and they can be sort of any length. They could be as long as you want them to be, but scientific publications typically have a very strict format that they follow, and there's usually a word limit from the journal, and that's because most journals used to actually print all of their articles into paper journals, and so the longer they are, the more expensive it is to print. Now a lot of journals are only online, but they still have word limits because they don't want the papers to be too long, or people probably won't read them.
អញ្ចឹងនៅក្នុង report ធម្មតាយើងអាចដាក់រូបថតរូបអីអញ្ចឹងទៅប៉ុន្តែ scientific report journal publication ហ្នឹងគឺវាអត់មាន space សម្រាប់ឲ្យយើងដាក់រូបទាំងអស់ហ្នឹងទេ journal article ពីទៅវាខ្លីគេកំណត់ page កំណត់អីអញ្ចឹងទៅយើងអាចទៅ report យើងអាចដាក់ 4-10 page តាមចិត្តយើងវាយណាក៏បានដាក់អីក៏បានgraph មានពណ៌មាន figure អីចឹងមាន color មានអីតែនៅក្នុង publication ហ្នឹងគឺយើងធ្វើអញ្ចឹងអត់បានទេដោយសារគេមាន word limit វាអត់វែងទេទៅ4-10អីចឹងទៅ maximum ព្រោះបើសិនជាវែងពេកក៏មានអ្នកមើលដែរហើយពីមុនគេបោះពុម្ពវាទាំងអស់តែឥឡូវវា online គេនៅតែ follow style បោះពុម្ពហ្នឹងក៏ដែរហើយមួយទៀតសម្រាប់ graph អីដែលសំខាន់ហ្នឹងគឺកម្រិតដែលគេឲ្យចេញជា color អញ្ចឹងពេលដែលយើងធ្វើ graph ក៏យើងត្រូវគិតដែរថាធ្វើមិនឲ្យវាពេលដែលយើង turn វាជាពณ៌សខ្មៅយើងមើលឃើញអត់អីអត់ចឹងណា
And so we had received a question earlier from Sophia asking, does academic vocabulary matter for report writing? And I think that's one of the things that might be different also between a report and a scientific publication. So with a scientific publication, your audience is other scientists or other academics. And so it's okay then, or it's expected, I think, to use academic vocabulary or more advanced scientific vocabulary when you're writing a scientific publication. With a report, it really depends on who your audience is. So if the report is only going to be read by other academics or other scientists, then maybe it's okay to still use that academic language. But if your report is for a donor or for a community or for the general public or stakeholders that are not scientists, then it's important for the reports to be using more simple language or to explain the topics in a way that can be understood by non-scientists or non-academics.
សំណួរមួយបានពី Sophie គាត់និយាយពីប្រភេទពាក្យដែលប្រើសម្រាប់ report writing ថាវាជ្រៅប៉ុណ្ណាតាមពិតទៅបើនៅក្នុង journal article គេប្រើពាក្យជ្រៅ academic scientific vocabulary ហ្មងពាក្យសម្រាប់សារអានព្រោះដោយសារអ្នកអានគឺភាគច្រើន scientific គាត់មើលទៅយល់ក្នុង field ហ្នឹងអីចឹងទៅប៉ុន្តែបើសិនជា report គឺអាស្រ័យទៅលើ audience របស់យើងគាត់នៅជាទូទៅពេលដែលយើងធ្វើ report យើងធ្វើសម្រាប់ donor យើងធ្វើសម្រាប់សហគមន៍មនុស្សទូទៅអញ្ចឹងពេលដែលយើងប្រើ scientific vocabulary ហ្នឹងគាត់អាចអត់យល់អញ្ចឹងគួរតែប្រើពាក្យ simple ពាក្យធម្មតាទៅចា៎
And so if you really want to learn more about this topic and how what it takes to produce a scientific publication, I hope that many of you will be able to attend the training that's being held tomorrow in person by Neil Fury from Flora and Fauna International. And he is going to be talking about specifically how to write for publication in a scientific journal. So you'll see that there's a lot of similarity and some overlap between report writing and scientific paper writing, but there are some very key differences that it's important to keep in mind that are specific to publication. So I hope that you'll be able to check out that training.
យើងមិនសិនជាចង់រៀនបន្ថែមថារបៀបសរសេរ scientific ឬក៏ publish paper ហ្នឹងតាមរបៀបណាស្អែកហ្នឹងសង្ឃឹមថាអ្នកនៅក្នុង workshop នេះព្រឹកនេះអាចចុះឈ្មោះចូលរៀនបានរៀននៅ CKCC ម៉ោង 8 ដល់ម៉ោង 12 ហើយរៀនដោយ trainer របស់យើងហ្នឹងគឺ Neil ហើយគាត់មានបទពិសោធន៍ការងារជាមួយការបោះពុម្ពផ្សាយហ្នឹងការបោះពុម្ព journal ហ្នឹងច្រើនដោយសារគាត់កាន់ Cambodian Natural History, right?
Yes, yeah, he's the editor of the Cambodian Journal of Natural History.
ចាគាត់ជា editor អញ្ចឹងគាត់មានបទពិសោធន៍ការងារហ្នឹងច្រើនស្អែកហ្នឹងយើងធ្វើ in person បានន័យថាចូលថ្នាក់រៀនហ្មងមិនមែនក្នុង Zoom ទេអញ្ចឹងយើងអត់មាន link ទេ
Great. So that concludes my portion of this training. And so with the remaining time, I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have. So we can go through the chat and I can see if there were some other questions that we didn't get to. Also feel free to raise your hand within Zoom. And I think there's some questions about, so the Neil's training tomorrow is going to be in person, and I don't think it's going to be recorded, but it might be possible to share the slides with people after the fact. So, but you can follow up with Putili about that if you're interested in getting the information about tomorrow's scientific training. So yeah, just going back to some of the questions that people were asking earlier. There was a question about, let's see, whether it's possible to use unpublished data that was cited in a published report. And so I think if you're wanting to reference someone else's unpublished data, it's important that you look at the whole data, that you can get access to the data yourself. So even if the researchers haven't published it, if you want to be drawing conclusions about some of that data or interpreting or using it in some way, it's important for you to actually look at the full data set yourself. Whether you get that from the other researchers or whether they've presented it somewhere. But if someone just says, makes a claim about something and then says this is based on unpublished data from this organization, if you want to use that information, then it's important to go to the original source and try to get access to that unpublished data yourself if you also want to be sharing it in your own report.
មានសំណួរមួយគាត់សួរថាបើសិនជាគាត់អាចប្រើ unpublished data នឹងបានអត់អញ្ចឹងបើសិនយើងនៅឃើញនៅក្នុង literature ណាហើយគេនិយាយពាក្យហ្នឹងយើងគួរតែទៅរកឯកសារហ្នឹងផ្ទាល់ទៅមើល original source ជាង cite ពីគេថានឹងជា unpublished data ហើយបើសិនជាយើងរកបាន data original source ហ្នឹងហើយយើងយកមកវិភាគខ្លួនឯងហ្នឹងវារឹតតែល្អហើយ
I think there was another question about how do you access that raw data or data from someone's report, and it really does require communicating directly with the scientists themselves and seeing if they are open to sharing that data with you. So if they haven't published the data, sometimes there's a movement towards requiring people to publish the data that they use in certain studies or include it as an appendix or a supplement. But if they don't, then you really need to contact them directly and maybe see if you can develop a relationship with them and see if they will be willing to share that data with you. And sometimes that might mean, needing to develop trust with them or develop some kind of relationship, get to know them and explain why you want to have access to their data. And that might make it more likely that they will share it with you.
ចឹងសំណួរមួយទៀតគាត់សួរថាគាត់អាចធ្វើមិនឲ្យទទួលបានឬក៏ access ទៅ raw data ហើយជាទូទៅ raw data រៀងពិបាក access ដោយសារតែវាមាននៅក្នុងដៃ scientist មួយអញ្ចឹងដែលយើងអាចធ្វើបានគឺតាក់ទងទៅគាត់ផ្ទាល់ហើយសុកទៅសុំក៏ពិបាកអាចពិបាកដែរអញ្ចឹងយើងត្រូវ build trust ហើយយើងត្រូវបញ្យល់ថាយើងយកមកធ្វើអីមិនយកទៅលក់ដូរឬក៏អីចឹងទៅបើយើងបញ្យល់គាត់ច្បាស់លាស់គាត់ច្បាស់ជាឲ្យហើយអញ្ចឹងមានតែមួយទេគឺតាក់ទងទៅអ្នកដែលធ្វើផ្ទាល់ត្មង
And then there was a question about the difference between a report submitted to the government and one submitted to donors, since sometimes the government might be sensitive to research or innovation data, what we should and shouldn't do for reports submitted to the government. So I don't know if I'm necessarily the best person to answer this question. If there is, one answer to this question, I think it's really going to depend on your situation. I'm not sure if other people in the training have something that they want to weigh in on related to this, but yeah, I think if there are sensitivities around certain types of data, then that's something that I think you'll have to assess on a case-by-case basis. But I will advocate for, I think it's important just for science and scientists to try to be as transparent as possible about their studies and their data, and to try to only present the most accurate and correct data, even if it might be, not supporting some conclusion that a certain audience might want to see. I think it's important for scientists to stick to the data and to show, to report what they actually observe in the field.
សំណួរមួយទៀតគឺសួរថា report ដែលយើងទៅសេឲ្យ donor ហើយនឹង report សម្រាប់ government គឺវាគួរតែខុសគ្នាឬក៏អត់ដោយសារតែព័ត៌មានខ្លះវា sensitive ហើយ government ខ្លះគាត់ sensitive ដែរតែប៉ុន្តែវាអាស្រ័យទៅលើស្ថាប័នណាមួយប្រទេសណាមួយវាដូច case by case អញ្ចឹងក្នុងការ deal មួយ station មួយនឹងតែក្នុងនាមជា scientist យើងគួរតែធ្វើអីឲ្យវា transparent បានន័យថាយើងមានតម្លាភាពហើយយើងនៅកណ្ដាលអញ្ចឹងយើងគួរតែ communicate scientific result របស់យើង in a transparency way កុំឲ្យវាមានតម្លាភាពឲ្យឃើញថាស្អីដែលយើងធ្វើហ្នឹងយើងមានអីលាក់លៀមទេជាងលាក់ព័ត៌មានអញ្ចឹងអីដែលយើងរកឃើញយើងគួរតែចែកចាយដោយស្មារតីគ្នាទៅគ្រប់ចំពោះ
So if people have other questions, they are welcome to put them in the chat, and we're happy to review them. We do have one last component of the training today, and that is to ask everyone to take a quick survey or quiz about this training. So the first part is just a quick quiz related to the example report that I shared with you. And then the second part is to just get your feedback about today's training, which would be really useful for us. So I just put the link to the form in the Google chat. And I might try sharing my screen again so I can show the form to everyone. So this is the quiz that we're asking if everyone could just log on and take a few minutes to fill this out. And then we can go over the answers to the first 4 questions together in a few minutes after everyone's had a chance to fill this out. And also, you can continue to keep asking questions too related to, okay, it says that some permission is needed. Let's see if I can change the permission.
គឺមាន quiz មួយចង់ដឹងថាយើងរៀនមកព្រឹកហ្នឹងយើងយល់បានប៉ុណ្ណាហើយទាំងអស់គ្នាអាចចូល click ទៅ link ហ្នឹងទៅហើយឆ្លើយនឹងសំណួរមិនច្រើនទេដូចជា 4 សំណួរហើយយើងបកមកវិញមើលចម្លើយថាទាំងអស់គ្នាយល់ច្រើនឬក៏យើងមានអីពិភាក្សាថែមទៀតហើយបើនៅតែមានសំណួរអាចdrop នៅក្នុង chat box នឹងបានណា អ្នកដែលគាត់ click link គាត់ថា need permission អញ្ចឹង Erin គាត់សុំពេលកែបន្តិច
Okay, so I've tried updating the permissions here, so let's see if that helps for other people to be able to access this the form. If not, we'll work on it and you can fill it out after the training. But we could go through these questions here.
Yeah, it doesn't work with me. It still need permission.
Okay.
Let's go through it.
Okay, so maybe we can just go through it live then, and you can type your responses into the chat, and we'll fill this out, or we'll work on getting the permissions fixed. But the first question is asking about the in the example report. And so to answer all these questions, you just need to refer to the table of contents section of the report that I showed you. And as we mentioned, there isn't an official introduction section to that report, but there is a different section that plays a similar role as the introduction. So the answers are, is it the executive summary? Is it the evaluation overview, the project context and sampling approach, or the data processing and analysis? So which one do people think is playing a similar role as the introduction?
តើទាំងអស់គ្នាយើងធ្វើ quiz នៅលើនេះទាំងអស់គ្នាហ្មងទៅ Siwothen គាត់ឆ្លើយហើយគឺមួយ executive summary អ្នកផ្សេងទៀត B
Great. Yeah, I think, yeah, some different answers here, but yeah, so the answer would be B, because as we mentioned, the executive summary is plays a different role than the introduction. The executive summary is a summary of the entire report. So it has introduction, methods, results, and discussion all in the executive summary, whereas the introduction is more of the overview. And in this case, the evaluation overview is similar as the is another way of saying introduction. So good job, everyone. Sorry, and again, yeah, I'm still looking to figure out how to share this form with you, but I think it'll probably happen after the training. So.
អញ្ចឹងចម្លើយគឺ B ដោយសារតែ executive summary គឺសង្ខេបសង្ខេបមក whole report តែម្ដងតែបើ introduction គ្រាន់តែវានិយាយពីបរិបទសាវតាអីចឹងទៅអញ្ចឹងវាស្តៀងនឹងវាចូលទៅក្នុង section B evaluation overview វាដូច introduction ដែរ សំណួរទី 2 មិនដែរទាំងអស់គ្នា
Okay, so then, yeah, question number 2 is talking about how there isn't a section called methods in this report, but which of these are playing the same role as a method section? So the evaluation overview, the project context and sampling approach, data processing analysis, or both B and C. I see lots of answers coming in, but I think, yeah, the majority of people have indicated, yes, the answer is D. So both B and C, the project context and sampling approach. So that's basically the field methods that we were talking about earlier. And then data process and analysis is referring to the analysis methods that we talked about.
ចឹងសម្រាប់សំណួរទី 2 ចម្លើយគឺ D ដោយសារតែចឹងវា cover B ហើយនិង C ដោយសារតែ B គឺនិយាយពី sampling method គឺ field method ហ្នឹងឯងហើយ C និយាយពី analysis method ហើយវាចូលទៅក្នុងផ្នែកធំមួយរបស់ method.
Okay, great. So then the third question is asking which of the following figures are included in the example report. So we have a map of the study site, the photo of the project field methods, a photo of a species of interest, or all of the above. And I see the answers are coming in, and that's good. It looks like people were paying attention during my presentation, but yes, we had all of these different things are included in the example report. So great job, everyone.
សំណួរទី3ចម្លើយគឺ all of the above D ហ្នឹងឆ្លើយបានត្រូវទាំងអស់គ្នានេះបានន័យថាពេលរៀនហ្នឹងយកចិត្តទុកដាក់មែនតើ
Great. And then the last question is asking which of these would be considered subsections within the results section of the example report. So again, the hint is to look at the table of contents and to see which of these are listed as subsections under the results sections. So do we have the project site selection, sampling approach, and sampling timeline? Do we have species diversity, habitat assessments and site comparisons? Or is it evaluating the progress towards the intended impacts and insights? Okay, looks like people's opinions are split a little bit between A and B. But again, we're talking about the results section. So make sure you see which section is labeled results.
So subsection នៅក្នុង result អញ្ចឹង A B C D ហ្នឹងចម្លើយមួយណាដែរមានគំនិតផ្សេងៗគ្នាច្រើនហ្នឹង
So in this case, the answer would be B, because in the results, we have a section, if you look at the table of contents under results, there's a section for species diversity, one for relative abundance, and one for the habitat assessment and site comparison. So great. Well, thanks everyone for following along on our quiz. And we will look into getting the link more widely, that can be more widely shared with you. And we'll send it as a follow-up as part of our training evaluation. So I'm happy to stick around for another few minutes or so if people have additional questions, but thank you again for attending this training, and we hope that you've found it useful, and we hope that you'll continue to participate in the training series offered by the Wonders of the Mekong project.
ពួកយើងនឹង fix link ហ្នឹងឲ្យដែរហើយនឹងផ្ញើជូនដល់អ្នកគ្នាដើម្បីពេញម្ដងទៀតជាផ្នែកមួយនៃ post training អញ្ចឹងណា question ហើយអាចបានទៅ time តែយើងនឹងតាក់ទងហើយអរគុណដល់អ្នកគ្នាដែលចូលរួមបាននឹងពេញលេញហើយ active ទៀតទាំងឆ្លើយសំណួរទាំងសួរសំណួរហើយធ្វើ quiz ធ្វើអីទាំងអស់ហ្នឹងហើយក៏សង្ឃឹមថាអ្នកគ្នានឹងអាចចូលរួម training ផ្សេងទៀតបន្តទៀតដែល Wonder of the Mekong ហើយនឹងយ៉ាងឯក Ambassador រៀបចំឡើងហើយបើសិនជាមានសំណួរពួកខ្ញុំនឹងនៅត4-10 នាទីទៀតដើម្បីឆ្លើយណា
Yeah, thanks again for everyone for attending, and for Young Eco Ambassadors for your help with organizing, and to our translator, Samadi. I really appreciate all of your hard work. And I see we do have one question here that's asking, is it okay if you find out that your results are different from the results of previous findings, and if you can't find any previous findings that support your results? So that's a very interesting question. And I think that's why it's important with science. There is this there's been discussion about the importance of publishing what are called negative results, or sometimes when you don't find the result that you're expecting. And so sometimes people think that that's, it's not useful, but it actually is important to put that information out there. I mean, it's important to, I guess, to take a look at your study and make sure, did you do everything correctly? And have you analyzed your data in the proper way? Are the results that you're seeing, they really are the true results. And so then that could actually be interesting to people in your field if you say, well, this is exactly what I did. I followed all of, this process, and I found something that's different from what other people have found. And so then the next important step is for you to think about why that might be. Why do you think you found some results that are different from what other people who have worked in your field have found? And that could be the main focus of your discussion, is trying to talk about why you think you got the results that you did, and what does it mean that your results are different from what other people have found? What information does that tell you?
ចឹងមានសំណួរចុងក្រោយមួយដែលគាត់សួរថាបើសិនជាគាត់រកឃើញលទ្ធផលនឹងវាខុសពីឬក៏ផ្ទុយពីស្អីដែល study ពីមុនគេរកឃើញថាយើងគួរតែ discuss យើងគួរតែសរសេរបែបណានៅក្នុង discussion ព្រោះជាទូទៅយើងមានអី back up ពេលដែលទិន្នន័យឬក៏ result របស់យើងវាស្តៀងឬក៏មាន support ពី study ផ្សេងបើសិនជាអត់មានសោះហើយអត់មាន study ផ្សេង support ទេយើងគួរត្រូវធ្វើមិនចម្លើយតាមពិតអាហ្នឹងយើងអត់មានអីខុសទេឲ្យតែយើងប្រកាសក្នុងចិត្តថាស្អីដែលយើង analyze ហ្នឹងគឺត្រឹមត្រូវយើងអាច go back ថាយើងអាចទៅមើលវិញថាតែយើងធ្វើហ្នឹងត្រូវអត់ជាពិសេស data មានអីខុសមានអីអត់បើសិនជាយើង double check ហើយវានៅតែស្អីយើងឃើញហ្នឹងគឺតែខុសពីគេមែនគេហៅថា negative result ហ្នឹងវាមានអីខុសទេព្រោះយើងធ្វើយើង follow protocol យើងត្រឹមត្រូវពេលដែលយើងយកមក discuss បើទោះជាមានអត់មានអ្នក support study ផ្សេង support យើងនៅតែយកមកទៅសេបានទេតែយើងគួរតែឆ្លើយនឹងសំណួរថាហេតុអីក៏វាស្អីដែលយើងរកឃើញហ្នឹងវាផ្ទុយពីគេអញ្ចឹងមានចំណុចអីខ្លះអញ្ចឹងនៅក្នុង discussion យើងអាចនិយាយពីរឿងហ្នឹងណា
I want to thank everyone for all of your great questions and for being engaged and participating. It definitely makes the training a lot more interesting. So yeah, thank you again for your engagement. អរគុណទាំងអស់គ្នាម្ដងទៀតហើយអរគុណដែលចូលរួម active ហើយនៅបានដល់ចប់ចុងចប់ដើមមានសំណួរមានអីចឹងទៅហើយក៏អរគុណខាង YA ផងដែរចំពោះការរៀបចំ facilitate តាំងពីដើមមក One last question. Yeah, actually, Molly-Ban, could you clarify a bit more about what you would like to know about social science research? Or could you clarify your question a little bit more?
Molly-Ban អាចបើunmute ខ្លួនឯងហើយសួរសំណួរបានទេមើលនៅក្នុងនេះអត់ទាន់សូវយល់ Molly-Ban.
Okay, so that's fine. Yeah, but thank you again for everyone. I think if there's no other questions, can go ahead and end the training, and hope everyone will be able to participate in the in-person training tomorrow. And so, yeah, I encourage all of you to write scientific reports about your work, and then if relevant, to try to publish them in scientific journals, and that will keep advancing the state of conservation research in Cambodia and in the Mekong. So thank you again to everyone for attending.
អរគុណទាំងអស់គ្នាហើយសង្ឃឹមថាទាំងអស់គ្នាឬក៏អ្នកចូលរួមមួយចំនួនអាចចូលរួម training នៅថ្ងៃស្អែកនៅ CKCC ហើយនឹងសង្ឃឹមថាទាំងអស់គ្នានឹងចូលរួមក្នុងការសរសេរ scientific report ហើយនឹង scientific journal ដើម្បីការងារអភិរក្សការងារទន្លេមេគង្គរបស់យើងណា
All right, great. Thank you again, everyone. And I think we'll conclude the training now.
អញ្ចឹងយើងសូមបញ្ចប់ training ថ្ងៃនេះព្រឹកនេះនៅស្មើនេះហើយណា សង្ឃឹមជួបគ្នានៅ training វគ្គក្រោយ